Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever wondered what stories linger within the walls of your home? This question haunted me as I stood in my freshly renovated apartment. The smell of fresh paint filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of sawdust. The contractors had finished their work a week ago, leaving me alone to restore a sense of normalcy to my life. Yet, from the very first night, something felt off. I had spent the entire day unpacking boxes, organizing bookshelves, and trying to make this place truly mine. It was late when I decided to tackle the old wardrobe in the guest room. Unlike the rest of the furniture, this piece was left behind by the previous tenants. Its heavy oak doors groaned when I opened them, revealing a surprisingly clean interior. But as I reached into the back corner, my fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. Frowning, I pulled out an object wrapped in aged, yellowed fabric. Unfolding the cloth, I found a porcelain doll staring back at me. Its face was cracked, its eyes eerily lifelike. There was something unnervingly deliberate about the way it seemed to meet my gaze. Shrugging off the discomfort, I set the doll aside and continued rummaging. More items emerged, a tarnished silver comb, a faded photograph of a family I didn't recognize, and an old leather journal. The items felt foreign, intrusive, like they didn't belong in my home. That night, I lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than it should. The wardrobe doors in the guest room, though firmly closed when I left them, suddenly felt like they might open at any moment. At precisely 3 a.m, I woke to a sharp sound, a thud, as if something heavy had fallen. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the guest room. The wardrobe stood there, silent and still. But on the floor, the porcelain doll lay on its side, its glassy eyes reflecting the faint glow of moonlight. I distinctly remembered leaving it on the desk. Swallowing hard, I picked up the doll and shoved it back into the wardrobe, slamming the door shut. This time, I jammed a chair against the handles for good measure. I told myself it was just my imagination, a mix of fatigue and lingering unease about the old furniture. The next morning, I decided to throw the items away. I placed the doll, the comb, the photograph, and the journal into a garbage bag and carried it out to the dumpster. I told myself I'd solved the problem, that the unsettling relics of the past were finally gone. But by the time night fell, the wardrobe was no longer empty. Inside, the porcelain doll sat upright, perfectly positioned, as though it had never left. I froze in the doorway, staring at the doll. Its cracked face seemed to smile mockingly at me, though I knew that wasn't possible. My pulse quickened as a cold sweat broke out across my back. I had thrown it away. I knew I had. The wardrobe was closed when I left it, yet now it stood ajar, the doll sitting right at the edge, as if waiting for me. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to approach it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I had imagined taking it out to the trash. Old junk, that's all, I muttered aloud, though my voice trembled. I grabbed the doll, its porcelain surface icy against my skin, and slammed it into a cardboard box. I taped the box shut and carried it out of the room. I hesitated, then shoved the box into the hallway closet. Out of sight, out of mind, I whispered. It sounded convincing enough to calm me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed magnified, echoing in the silence. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like paper being crumpled. My breath hitched as I strained to listen. It came from the hallway. I forced myself out of bed and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, except for a faint sliver of light spilling from the closet. My stomach twisted into knots. I had turned that light off earlier. The rustling grew louder as I approached. My fingers trembled as I reached for the closet handle. With a deep breath, I flung the door open. The box was ripped open, its contents strewn across the floor. The doll sat in the middle of the mess, its head tilted, as if regarding me. Next to it lay the photograph, and something new, a pair of tiny footprints made of dust, leading out of the closet and disappearing into the hallway. I backed away, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number of my friend, Claire. She was the only person I could trust with something this bizarre. "Hello?" Her groggy voice came through the receiver. "Claire," I whispered, glancing back at the closet, "something's wrong in this house. I found things, and they keep coming back." She sighed, waking up fully. "What things? What's going on?" I described the doll, the other objects, and the inexplicable events. I could hear her skepticism even before she spoke. "Maybe it's just stress," she offered. "You've been through a lot lately. Moving, the renovation." "It's not stress," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "I know what I saw. These things don't make sense, Claire. They're wrong." After a long pause, she sighed. "Fine. I'll come over tomorrow. We'll figure it out, okay?" I agreed, though morning felt an eternity away. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, every light in the house blazing. The doll, the footprints, the photograph. I tried to tell myself it was all a nightmare, but deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. And I was no longer in control of my own home. The morning sunlight offered little comfort. By the time Claire arrived, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. She gave me a concerned look as I ushered her inside. "Okay," she said, setting her bag down, "show me." I led her to the guest room, half expecting the wardrobe to be empty, as if everything had been a figment of my imagination. But when I opened the doors, the doll was there again. This time, it sat slightly tilted, as though it had been moved. Claire frowned. "Creepy, but it's just a doll." "It wasn't here last night," I insisted. "I threw it out. Twice." Her skepticism was evident. She picked up the doll and examined it, turning it over in her hands. "Maybe someone's messing with you." "A neighbor? The contractors?" I shook my head. The doors were locked. Nobody else has the keys. Claire sighed. "Okay, let's get rid of it. Together. I'll drive it out myself if it'll make you feel better." We packed the doll, the comb, the photograph, and the journal into a trash bag. This time, Claire insisted we drive to the landfill. I felt a flicker of hope as we watched the items disappear into the massive pit of garbage. "You see?" Claire said, giving me a reassuring smile. "Gone for good." By the time we got back, I almost believed her. The house felt lighter, the air less oppressive. Claire stayed for lunch, chatting about work and trying to distract me. For a few hours, it worked. But as the afternoon turned to evening, a heavy silence settled over the house. Claire noticed it too. "Do you hear that?" she asked, pausing mid-sentence. I frowned. "Hear what?" She pointed toward the guest room. "It's like scratching." My stomach dropped. Together, we crept toward the door. The noise grew louder, rhythmic, like nails dragging against wood. I hesitated before opening the door, my hand shaking on the knob. Inside, the wardrobe stood exactly as we had left it, closed and seemingly harmless. But the scratching didn't stop. Claire gestured for me to open it. Summoning all my courage, I flung the doors wide. The wardrobe was empty. But the scratching continued, now louder, coming from the walls. Claire stepped back, her face pale. "What is that?" Before I could answer, something fell from the ceiling, a small object that clattered to the floor. We both jumped back. It was the silver comb. My vision swam as I stared at it. Claire looked at me, panic in her eyes. "You saw me throw that away," she whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. Suddenly, the scratching stopped, replaced by a low creak. Both of us turned toward the wardrobe. Its doors, though open, now began to close on their own. A shadow moved behind them, and for the first time, I saw it, a figure, barely visible, hunched and unnatural. It moved with jerky, stuttering motions, as though it didn't belong in this world. Claire screamed, grabbing my arm. "We need to leave. Now!" We bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind us. My heart pounded as we stood in the hallway, gasping for breath. "What the hell is going on?" Claire demanded. "I don't know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "But it's not just the things. There's something here." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the guest room, heading toward the door. The footsteps stopped just as they reached the guest room door. Claire and I stood frozen, our backs pressed against the far wall of the hallway. My entire body trembled, and Claire's grip on my arm was so tight it hurt. The doorknob rattled. Slowly, the door creaked open. "Run," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. We bolted for the front door, not daring to look back. My hands fumbled with the lock, the key slipping from my grasp. Claire snatched it and turned the lock just as the sound of shuffling footsteps came from the hallway. We burst into the street, gasping for air under the cold light of the street lamps. The house loomed behind us, its windows dark and foreboding. "What the hell was that?" Claire demanded, pacing in circles. "I told you," I said, my voice shaking. "There's something in there. It's not just the doll or the things. It's the house." Claire shook her head, disbelief and fear written across her face. "No, that's not possible. This is. I don't know what this is, but it's not real." "It is," I insisted. "It's real, and it's getting stronger." We stood there for what felt like hours, too afraid to go back inside but unable to leave without a plan. Finally, Claire grabbed my shoulders. "We need help. Someone who knows about this kind of thing." I nodded numbly, not knowing who to call or where to start. The next day, Claire returned with someone, a local historian she found online, an older woman named Miss Harper. Her eyes were sharp, and she carried an air of quiet authority as she entered the house. "This place has a history," she said after listening to my story. "A long one. But it's not the house itself. It's the objects you've disturbed. They hold pieces of the past, fragments of lives that have left a stain. She pulled out a bundle of sage and a small vial of water. "We'll cleanse the space," she said firmly. Claire and I followed her as she moved through the house, murmuring prayers and burning the sage. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. When we reached the guest room, Miss Harper hesitated. "This is where it's strongest," she said. The wardrobe loomed before us, its doors now slightly ajar. "I need you to open it," she said, looking at me. My throat tightened, but I nodded. With trembling hands, I stepped forward and pulled the doors wide. Inside, the doll sat upright, perfectly positioned. Around it, the other items had returned: the comb, the journal, and the photograph. But now, there was something else. A faint figure, barely more than a shadow, crouched at the back of the wardrobe. Its eyes glowed faintly, and as I stared, it began to move forward. Miss Harper threw the vial of water at the figure, shouting words I didn't understand. The shadow let out a guttural, inhuman sound and recoiled, fading back into the darkness. The room shook as though the house itself was protesting. The wardrobe doors slammed shut, and the noise stopped. "It's done," Miss Harper said, her voice steady but tired. "Is it gone?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Miss Harper shook her head. "Not entirely. These things never truly go away. But for now, it's contained." That night, I stood in the guest room, staring at the wardrobe. The house felt different, lighter, quieter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, just out of sight. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of the photograph on the desk. It wasn't supposed to be there. The family in the photo was smiling, but their faces had changed. They were looking directly at me. The sight of the photograph stopped me cold. My breath hitched as I stared at the faces. Their eyes, once dull and faded with age, now gleamed with a sinister light. The family in the image, mother, father, and child, wore smiles that didn't feel human. They weren't smiles of joy but of malice, like they knew something I didn't. I grabbed the photograph and sprinted out of the guest room, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I set the picture down on the kitchen table, desperate to understand what was happening. The house was silent, but I felt its weight pressing down on me, as though it were alive, watching. Claire called me later that night. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "It's not over," I finally said. "I don't think it'll ever be over." "Maybe you should leave the house," she suggested. "Sell it. Get out while you can." I wanted to agree, but I knew the truth. Whatever was happening wasn't just tied to the house. It was tied to me. The next few days were quiet, unnervingly so. The photograph remained on the table, though I avoided looking at it. The wardrobe stayed closed. For the first time in weeks, I almost felt normal. But on the fifth night, the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, coming from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. I lay in bed, paralyzed, as the sound surrounded me. Then came the whispers, soft at first, barely audible, but growing clearer with each passing moment. "Why did you disturb us?" The voice was low and raspy, and it seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The whispers stopped, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. And then, from the hallway, I heard the unmistakable sound of the wardrobe doors creaking open. I couldn't stay in bed. Gripping the bedside lamp like a weapon, I forced myself into the hallway. The air was icy, each step sending chills through my body. The guest room door was open, light spilling into the dark corridor. I stepped inside. The wardrobe doors were wide open, and the doll was gone. Instead, the journal lay on the floor, open to a page filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting. I bent down to read it. They won't let me go. They're always here, always watching. I thought I could leave, but they followed. I thought I could burn the things, but they returned. The only way to escape is to join them. The final sentence was underlined so deeply that it had torn through the page. I barely had time to process the words before the light in the room flickered and went out. In the darkness, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps. They were closer this time, coming from behind me. I turned, the lamp trembling in my hand, and saw them. The family from the photograph stood in the doorway, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their bodies moved with an unnatural, jerking motion. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I whispered. The child stepped forward, tilting its head. "To stay," it said, its voice layered with echoes. "With you." The next thing I remember is waking up on the floor, sunlight streaming through the window. The room was empty. The wardrobe was closed. But the photograph was on the floor beside me, its faces staring up at me with blank, lifeless expressions. I left the house that day. I didn't pack anything. I didn't look back. I sold it as quickly as I could, leaving behind the wardrobe, the photograph, and every unsettling memory. But no matter how far I go, I can still hear the whispers at night. And sometimes, I see them in the shadows. Have you ever heard a sound so out of place it made your skin crawl? A sound that didn't belong, yet seemed to seep into the air around you, demanding your attention? It started one quiet evening as I walked home from the edge of town. I lived near an old railway track, abandoned for decades, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. The rails are rusted, the ties half buried in dirt. No train had passed through in years. And yet, that night, as I walked past the tracks, I heard it. The low rumble of wheels on steel. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But the sound grew louder, clearer, a steady clatter of a train approaching at high speed. I stopped and looked around, but the tracks were empty, stretching into the darkness like forgotten veins. The sound passed me, a rush of wind that chilled my skin. I froze, my heart pounding. It felt as though something massive and invisible had just hurtled by. I waited, listening. The night was silent again, except for the distant hum of crickets. I shook my head, trying to brush it off as a trick of the wind or some distant echo. But I couldn't shake the unease. The next day, I told myself it was nothing. I had been tired, maybe even a little paranoid after working late. But as evening fell, my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back to the tracks. The area was eerily quiet. The flashlight beam danced over the overgrown rails, illuminating patches of rust and old gravel. I crouched down, running my fingers over the cold metal. There was no sign of recent use. No footprints, no grooves from wheels. And yet, as I stood, the sound returned. This time, it was faint, a distant whistle, mournful and haunting. It echoed through the night, sending shivers down my spine. I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My breath quickened as I stepped off the path and into the brush. The sound grew louder, as though I were moving closer to its source. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming with every step. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The whistle faded, replaced by a new sound, voices. Low, murmuring voices, like a crowd whispering just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. "Who's there?" I shouted, gripping the flashlight tighter. The voices stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. And then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, hovering just above the tracks. It flickered like an old lantern, swaying gently as though carried by an unseen hand. I took a step closer, unable to tear my eyes away. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. My flashlight flickered again before going out entirely. The light ahead pulsed, brightening for a moment before fading. As it dimmed, I thought I saw shapes behind it, shadowy figures standing motionless on the tracks. A cold dread washed over me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping on the uneven ground. The light disappeared, and with it, the shapes. I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Back home, I locked the door and leaned against it, struggling to catch my breath. My mind raced, replaying what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. I told myself it couldn't be real. Lights could be reflections, and sounds could carry from miles away. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whistle again. It was closer this time, rising and falling like a song from the past, pulling me toward it. And then came the voices, whispering in the dark. "Help us." The voices stayed with me long after they faded into the night. I barely slept, my mind churning with questions I couldn't answer. By morning, I was exhausted but determined. If there was something haunting those tracks, I had to know what it was. I decided to start with the town records. The library was a dusty old building that smelled of paper and mildew, but it held decades worth of history. I spent hours combing through newspapers and archives, searching for anything connected to the old railway. And then I found it. An article from 50 years ago, the headline stark and chilling, "Tragic train derailment claims dozens of lives." My hands trembled as I read the story. The train had been a night express, carrying passengers through the quiet countryside. Something had gone wrong with the tracks, and the train had derailed just outside of town. Survivors were few. Most of the passengers had been trapped in the wreckage, unable to escape before the fire consumed them. The article included a photo of the crash site. The mangled cars lay scattered across the tracks, their twisted forms barely recognizable. I felt a sinking dread as I realized the crash had occurred on the very stretch of railway I walked past every day. That evening, I returned to the tracks. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown path. I carried a backpack with supplies, my flashlight, a notebook, and an old lantern I'd found in the garage. As I approached the spot where I first heard the train, the air seemed to change. It was colder, heavier, as though the atmosphere itself was thick with something unseen. I stopped and listened. At first, there was nothing but the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, slowly, the sound began to creep in, a low rumble, like the distant echo of wheels on steel. The whistle followed, long and mournful, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned on the lantern and stepped onto the tracks. The sound grew louder, and the air vibrated with an almost electric energy. I walked cautiously, the light from the lantern casting eerie shadows on the overgrown rails. And then I saw it again, the faint, flickering light in the distance. It swayed gently, moving closer. This time, I didn't run. Instead, I stood my ground, my heart pounding in my chest. The light grew brighter, and with it, the shadows behind it became clearer. Figures emerged, men and women, their faces pale and expressionless. They stood silently on the tracks, their eyes fixed on me. The lantern in my hand flickered, and I felt a chill race down my spine. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the sound of the phantom train. The figures didn't answer, but the voices returned, soft and pleading. "Help us, remember." I wasn't sure what they meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the wreck and these apparitions were connected. The sound of the train grew deafening, and for a moment I could almost see it, a massive, shadowy locomotive barreling toward me. The light from the train illuminated the figures on the tracks, and for a split second, their faces contorted in terror. I stumbled backward, my lantern clattering to the ground. The sound of the train roared past me, and I braced myself for impact, but nothing came. When I opened my eyes, the tracks were empty. The figures were gone, and the night was silent once more. I returned home, shaken but resolute. If these spirits were trapped, if they needed help to move on, I had to figure out how. I spent the rest of the night piecing together the details of the crash. The article mentioned a conductor, a man named Henry Price, who had tried to save as many passengers as he could before succumbing to the flames. His actions were hailed as heroic, but his name seemed to carry an air of tragedy, as though he bore the blame for what had happened. The whispers still echoed in my mind. Help us remember. What had been forgotten? And why did it feel like they were waiting for me to find it? The next morning, I couldn't shake the sense of urgency. The spirits weren't just haunting the tracks, they were trying to communicate. They needed something from me, and I had to figure out what it was. I started by searching for more information about Henry Price. The library yielded little, a few articles praising his bravery, some condolences from the families of the victims, but nothing to explain why his name lingered in my mind like a shadow. It wasn't until I visited the town's historical society that I found what I was looking for. A weathered journal sat among a collection of artifacts from the old railway. The tag read, "Property of H. Price." My hands shook as I opened the journal. The pages were brittle and stained, the handwriting slanted and hurried. It began with routine entries about schedules and maintenance, but as I flipped through, the tone shifted. March 3rd. Something is wrong with the tracks near the bend. I reported it to the inspector, but he dismissed my concerns. Said the budget won't allow for repairs right now. March 10th. The tracks are worse than I thought. I stayed late to check them myself. The rails are warped. It's dangerous, but no one will listen. March 12th. I can't stop thinking about it. If something happens, it'll be on me. I need to do something before it's too late. The entries stopped abruptly after March 12th. My chest tightened as I realized what this meant. Henry Price had known about the faulty tracks. He tried to warn people, but had been ignored. The crash wasn't just an accident, it was a preventable tragedy. The voices echoed in my mind again. Help us remember. I felt a chill run down my spine. The spirits weren't asking for justice, they wanted their story to be told. That evening, I returned to the tracks with the journal. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive silence that made every rustle of leaves sound deafening. The lantern cast long shadows as I approached the spot where I had seen the figures before. I stopped and opened the journal, reading the final entries aloud. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "He tried to save you. He tried to warn them, but no one listened." The air around me grew colder, and the flickering light appeared once more, swaying gently in the distance. The shadows emerged again, the figures standing silently on the tracks. This time, their faces were different. They weren't blank or expressionless. They looked at me with a mix of sorrow and relief. The voices returned, soft and clear. "Thank you." The light brightened, enveloping the figures. One by one, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the glow. The last to disappear was a man in a conductor's uniform. He tipped his hat to me before vanishing into the light. And then it was gone. I stood there for a long time, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. The tracks were silent once more, just an abandoned stretch of metal and with lost to time. I knew I'd done what they needed. Their story was no longer buried beneath decades of silence. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the faint whistle of a train in the distance. And this time, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a farewell. Days passed, and the events on the tracks haunted my thoughts. Even though the apparitions had vanished, their presence lingered in my mind. I couldn't help but feel that there was something unresolved, something I had yet to understand. The journal stayed on my bedside table, its brittle pages a silent reminder of the tragedy. Every night, as I lay in bed, I would hear faint sounds, the whistle of a train, the murmur of voices. They were softer now, less desperate, but they never fully left. One evening, I decided to return to the tracks, not out of fear or obligation, but out of curiosity. I felt drawn to the place, as though it still had more to tell me. The night was clear, the sky speckled with stars. I walked along the overgrown path, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. The air was crisp, and the faint scent of damp earth hung in the air. When I reached the spot where the apparitions had appeared, I stopped and looked around. The tracks were just as they had always been, silent, forgotten. But something felt different. I took out the journal, flipping through its pages again. The final entry caught my eye, not for what it said, but for what I hadn't noticed before, a faint impression on the next page, as though someone had written on it and torn the sheet out. Curiosity burned in my chest. I tilted the journal under the moonlight, trying to make out the marks. The words were faint but legible enough to piece together. "The lantern will guide you." My heart raced. The lantern. Was it referring to the one I had carried, or the spectral light I had seen? As if in response, the air grew colder, and the familiar flickering light appeared in the distance. This time, it didn't hover, it moved slowly, as though beckoning me to follow. I hesitated for a moment before gripping my own lantern and stepping onto the tracks. The light moved steadily ahead, and I followed, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The journey felt endless. The tracks stretched on and on, the light leading me deeper into the night. Eventually, I reached a bend where the trees opened up, revealing a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a crumpled, rusted mass of metal, the remains of the train. My breath caught in my throat. The twisted wreckage was almost unrecognizable, overgrown with vines and moss. It was as though the forest itself had tried to swallow it, to erase its existence. I approached cautiously, the lantern casting eerie shadows across the wreckage. The air was thick with an almost tangible energy, as though the past were pressing against the present. And then I saw it, a faint inscription on one of the metal panels, barely visible beneath the rust. "We waited for you." The words sent a chill through me. I knelt down, running my fingers over the cold, jagged surface. The voices returned, louder this time, but not chaotic. They were calm, united, as though speaking in unison. "We are free. But you are not done." Before I could respond, the light began to brighten, enveloping the clearing in a warm, golden glow. The wreckage shimmered, the vines and rust dissolving as though time itself were reversing. For a brief moment, I could see the train as it had once been, pristine, full of life, its windows glowing with light. The vision faded, and the clearing returned to silence. The light was gone, and so were the voices. But I knew what they meant. My role wasn't finished. There was more to uncover, more to remember. The train had been a symbol of tragedy, yes, but also of hope, a vessel carrying people with dreams, fears, and stories that deserve to be told. As I left the clearing, the journal clutched tightly in my hand, I felt a strange sense of purpose. The spirits had passed on, but their story would live. And perhaps, in telling it, I could finally quiet the echoes of the past. Weeks passed after that night, and the town slowly settled back into its quiet rhythm. The tracks remained abandoned, the old railway station long forgotten, but something had changed in me. I couldn't stop thinking about the wreckage, about the words inscribed on the metal, and the voices that had guided me through the darkness. The past was no longer something to be buried, it was a part of me now. The town had its own ghosts, but it seemed the one that lingered most was Henry Price. I often found myself walking past the old station, looking at the overgrown tracks, wondering if they still carried the echoes of that tragic night. There were no more apparitions, no more whispers, but I felt as if I was still being pulled toward the past. One evening, while walking through the station, I noticed something unusual, a faint light coming from the old signal tower at the far end of the platform. It wasn't the soft, flickering glow I had seen before, but a steady, warm light that seemed almost alive. Intrigued, I approached the tower. As I drew closer, the air around me seemed to hum with energy. The closer I got, the more vivid the light became, until it was almost blinding. I stepped inside, the lantern in my hand now unnecessary. The room was flooded with light, but there was no source, just an overwhelming sense of presence. And then I heard it, the whistle. Faint at first, like the sound of a train in the distance. But it was growing louder, nearer, until it seemed to fill the air itself. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure whether this was part of my memory or something happening right in front of me. The whistle pierced the silence, and I could almost see the train, its shadow crossing the platform, the figures of passengers moving past me. "Henry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The whistle stopped, and everything fell silent. The light around me dimmed, and for a moment, the room felt empty. But then, from the far corner of the tower, a figure emerged, tall, wearing a conductor's uniform. His face was drawn and tired, his eyes distant. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to understand. The train wasn't just a memory, it was a part of him, a part of those who had perished that night. They had never truly left. The figure raised a hand, gesturing for me to follow. Without a word, I walked toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved past the platform and down the tracks, the ghostly form of the train began to materialize in front of me. It wasn't just an illusion. It was real as the night of the accident. The train's lights flickered to life, and for a brief moment, I could see the passengers, smiling, talking, their faces filled with life. They were here, and they were waiting. The figure, Henry Price, looked back at me, his face solemn but not sad. There was no longer a need for words. The journey had come full circle. The spirits of the wrecked train were at peace now, their memories carried forward, not forgotten. With a final glance, Henry nodded, and the train slowly began to fade, its form dissipating into the darkness. The platform returned to its quiet state, the tracks silent once again. I stood there for a moment, breathless, taking in the weight of what had just happened. The town would never know what had truly transpired here, but I would. The story had been told, the truth had been uncovered, and the spirits were free. As I walked back home, the only sound was the soft crunch of gravel beneath my feet, the echoes of the past now fading into the night. The final whistle had sounded, and I had listened. I don't know how to explain it, but I need to try. Maybe writing this down will help me understand what's happening. It all started 2 nights ago. I had just come back from a long day at work. Nothing special, just the usual routine. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that always felt a little too loud when you're alone. I went to the kitchen, heated up some leftovers, and sat down to eat. My phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Emily. She's my best friend, the one I talk to almost every day. I smiled and picked up the phone, thinking she might have sent a funny meme or just checking in. But what I saw made my stomach twist. There was no message, just a single audio file. I almost didn't open it. I don't know why, but something about it felt off. I thought maybe it was a mistake or a glitch, but I pressed play anyway. At first, I thought it was just background noise, the kind of fuzz you hear when a message doesn't send properly. Then I realized there was someone talking, and it was my voice. I froze. The voice on the recording was unmistakably mine, but the words it spoke weren't anything I had ever said. The voice was calm, almost too calm, like someone who had rehearsed the words. I'm sorry. I didn't want to do this, but you forced my hand. My heart stopped. I immediately tried to replay the message, but when I pressed play again, it was gone. The file had disappeared, leaving nothing but a blank screen. Confused, I checked the rest of my phone. There were no other notifications, no signs that anything had happened. I even went into the settings, searching for any clue that something had gone wrong. But nothing was out of the ordinary. I brushed it off as a mistake. A weird glitch. Maybe it was some kind of app malfunction. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing that voice in my head. The words echoed, repeating over and over. You forced my hand. It was almost as if it had been a warning. But from who? And what did it mean? The next day, I decided to forget about it. I had to. I couldn't let my imagination run wild, especially over something so trivial. But then it happened again. This time, it was on a different phone call. I was speaking with my mom, just checking in like I do every Thursday afternoon. As I was talking to her, I heard a brief crackling sound in the background. My mom didn't seem to notice, but I could swear I heard a voice. Not hers, not mine. It was a low whisper, indistinct but undeniably there. I thought I was just hearing things. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. There was nothing unusual. But then I noticed something else, a new voicemail. I hadn't seen it come in. I opened it without hesitation, expecting it to be a mistake or spam. But once again, It was there. My voice. I know what you did. You can't hide from me. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. How? How was this happening? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to turn. And I didn't know how it could be possible, but I realized one terrifying truth. I had never recorded any of these messages. I didn't understand. How was this happening? How was my voice on these recordings when I hadn't said anything like that? I tried to rationalize it, but nothing made sense. I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next few days were a blur of confusion and dread. I started noticing little things that I hadn't before, things that only added to my growing sense of unease. At work, I could hear the faintest whisper of my own voice in the background of meetings, just for a moment, but it was always there. I'd turn around, but no one was ever looking at me. At night, I would go to bed exhausted, but as soon as I would drift off, I'd hear the faintest sound of my phone buzzing, even though it was silent. It was like the phone itself was trying to get my attention. I'd wake up, and sure enough, there would be new recordings waiting for me. Each one more disturbing than the last. You think you're in control, but I know what you've done. You can't escape. You never will. Each message felt like a warning. I tried deleting the voicemails immediately, but they kept coming back. I couldn't block it, couldn't stop it. It was like someone was manipulating the phone, using my own voice to torment me. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out to Emily again, telling her everything. She didn't seem as concerned as I expected her to be. It's just a glitch, she said. Phones do weird stuff sometimes. Have you tried resetting it? I had, of course, but the recordings came back. The messages weren't just some technical error. They were too personal, too specific, too real. I tried to explain this to her, but she just laughed it off. You're overthinking it, seriously. Just get some sleep. But I couldn't. That night, as I lay in bed, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it again. A faint, distorted version of my voice, as though it was coming from the other side of the room. It was almost as if the phone was alive, responding to my thoughts, watching my every move. I jumped out of bed and grabbed it from the nightstand, almost afraid to look at the screen. The latest recording was there, waiting for me. It's too late now. I've been in control all along. I stared at the message, my blood running cold. There was no sound, no indication that someone had actually recorded it. It was just there, my voice, but somehow wrong, twisted, distorted. I needed to get rid of the phone. I had to. But when I went to erase everything, when I tried to factory reset it again, I couldn't. The phone wouldn't let me. It was like the device itself was fighting back, locking me out of everything. I thought I could escape it, but then the phone vibrated in my hands. It was a call this time. A call that I didn't make. I didn't answer, but the screen flashed, showing an incoming call from my own number. I dropped it in horror, and the screen went black. Suddenly, the apartment felt cold. The silence became oppressive. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it again. My voice, quiet, almost soothing. You should have listened. I ran out of the apartment. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that place any longer. Someone was in control of my life now, and I had no way to stop it. The phone was gone now. I threw it in a trash bin, far from my reach, but I can still hear it sometimes. That faint, haunting whisper, like my own voice calling me back. I don't know who or what it was, but I can't escape it. It's always with me. Always. Maybe it's still out there, watching me. Maybe it never left. Or maybe it was me all along. I'm not sure where to begin. I'm so deep in this now, I don't know what's real anymore. I thought I was rid of it, but the moment I tossed that phone away, I felt something shift. I thought I could escape, but I haven't. After leaving my apartment, I found myself wandering the streets in a daze. The cold air cut through me, but it didn't bring any clarity. All I could hear was that voice, that echo of my own words. I kept thinking it was just in my head, that I was imagining things because I was exhausted. But then, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. But no matter where I went, I felt the presence, the weight of someone behind me. Watching. Waiting. I eventually found myself outside Emily's apartment. My best friend, the one who had laughed it off. I thought maybe she'd have some answers, maybe she could help me understand what was going on. But when she opened the door, she didn't look surprised to see me standing there. I figured you'd show up eventually, she said, her voice colder than I expected. I was about to ask her why she'd said that, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on her coffee table, was my old phone. My stomach twisted. How do you have that? I managed to choke out. I found it, she said nonchalantly. It was thrown in a trash bin down the street. You left it behind, didn't you? I couldn't respond. The phone was silent, but it didn't feel silent. I could feel it, the weight of it, as if it were alive, as if it were waiting for me to pick it up again. I shook my head. No, I didn't leave it behind. I threw it away on purpose. I can't explain it, but you have to understand, there's something wrong with it. Emily raised an eyebrow, a look of skepticism on her face. It's just a phone. You're letting your mind get the best of you. Here, take it back. Maybe you can fix whatever glitch it has. I reached for the phone, but something in me screamed not to touch it. But my hands betrayed me. They trembled, and I picked it up. As soon as my fingers made contact with the screen, it vibrated softly in my hand, and the screen lit up. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was calm, almost comforting. But the message sent a chill through me. I dropped the phone again, stepping back quickly. Emily looked at me like I was crazy. What is it? What did it say? She asked, voice filled with disbelief. I don't know how it's happening, I whispered. I didn't record any of this. It's like the phone is messing with my mind. Emily seemed genuinely concerned now, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She never had. She thought I was just scared of a malfunction. She didn't understand. I could feel the phone calling to me, the silent hum of its presence. And then, without thinking, I reached for it again. But this time, when I unlocked it, something was different. The screen showed a list of recordings, all with timestamps. Some were from hours ago, some from days ago, but all of them were labeled with my name. I felt my pulse race as I tapped one of them. The voice spoke, but it wasn't mine this time. It was Emily's. You're too late. We're already here. I couldn't breathe. I looked up at Emily, whose face had drained of color. She took a step back, but I could see the fear in her eyes now. "What did it say?" she asked, her voice trembling. I looked at her, unable to respond, unable to make sense of it all. But deep down, I knew. Whatever this was, it had followed me. It had followed us both. Something was wrong with the phone, but it was worse than I realized. This wasn't just about me. And whatever it wasn't just trying to reach me anymore. It was coming for us all. I ran out of Emily's apartment without saying another word. I didn't care if she thought I was losing my mind. I couldn't stay there. I had to get away, to find somewhere, anywhere that felt safe. But I knew deep down there was nowhere I could go to escape the voice. It had found me again. And now it was coming for everyone. I don't know what happened after I left Emily's apartment. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't think straight. My mind kept racing back to that voice, my voice, but not mine. I was running on instinct, trying to escape the sense of dread that seemed to follow me everywhere. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I walked for hours, down unfamiliar streets, through quiet alleys. The world around me felt distant, muffled, like I was trapped inside a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was all too real. At some point, I found myself in a park. It was dark, and the cold had begun to seep through my jacket. I sat down on a bench, my hands trembling. I couldn't escape it. The phone. The voice. It was always with me. I took a deep breath and pulled the phone out of my pocket. I didn't know why. Maybe I thought if I just listened, I could understand what was happening, why this was happening. But as soon as I unlocked it, my heart stopped. The screen lit up, and there, in front of me, was a new recording. The timestamp said it was from minutes ago. "We're closer than you think." I didn't need to listen to it. I already knew what it was. I'd heard it enough times by now. But what made my stomach twist was the realization that the message was new. I hadn't been near anyone. How could this be happening? My fingers shook as I pressed the play button. The voice, my voice, spoke again, this time softer, almost like it was whispering directly into my ear. "You thought you could run, but you can't hide. You can never hide." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I looked around, but the park was empty, silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I shoved the phone back into my pocket. But it wasn't over. The phone buzzed again. A message. Another recording. "It's already too late." I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. How was this possible? I had tossed the phone away. I had left it behind. Why was it following me? Why couldn't I escape it? I stood up quickly, the overwhelming sense of fear pushing me forward. I had to get out of here. I had to get away from the phone, from the voice. I turned to leave, but as I walked down the path, something caught my eye. A figure. A woman standing in the shadows, watching me. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her presence. It was like she was waiting for me to approach. Without thinking, I walked toward her, my legs moving on their own. The closer I got, the more I could see her, pale skin, dark hair, a long coat. She looked familiar. While I was just a few feet away from her, she finally spoke. "You should have listened to the warnings." I froze, my heart racing. Her voice, Her words sounded like the voice on the phone. The same voice. Only it wasn't just a recording now. It was real. It was here. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. I felt trapped, suffocated by the heaviness of the moment. You can't run from what you've already done, she continued, her voice low and chilling. You're part of it now. You always have been. I took a step back, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. The woman didn't move. She didn't need to. Her words were enough to paralyze me. The phone buzzed again. Another message. I looked down at it, but I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know what it would say. But I couldn't stop myself. I unlocked the phone, trembling as I did. The screen lit up. It's not over yet. We'll never let you go. I dropped the phone, but it didn't hit the ground. It hovered there, suspended in the air, before crashing to the earth with a sickening thud. I looked up, and the woman was gone. There was nothing left but the night, the empty park, and the faint buzzing of my phone as it lay on the ground. The voice was still in my head. The words. The threat. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. How much longer I could keep running from something that wasn't just chasing me, but had already claimed me. I picked up the phone again, but this time I didn't check the messages. I couldn't. I just kept walking. And I knew, deep down, that I was never going to escape. The world around me had become a blur, the night stretching endlessly, dark and oppressive. I don't know how long I walked for. Time didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the constant gnawing fear in my chest, the voice in my mind, the eerie presence that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I had to get home. But even as I walked through the streets, I knew it wouldn't help. I knew that wherever I went, whatever I did, the phone would follow. The voice would follow. I could feel it. It was all-consuming. It was inside of me, inside my thoughts. The moment I entered my apartment, I felt it again, the suffocating weight of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I didn't know if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. I walked into the living room, my eyes scanning the room. Empty. Silent. But as I turned toward the kitchen, I froze. The phone was on the counter. Ow! I had left it on the floor outside Emily's apartment. I had left it behind. I hadn't brought it with me. I hadn't touched it. Yet, there it was, as if it had always been here, waiting for me. My stomach twisted. I could feel it, the sense of dread building, the weight of something far beyond just technology. I reached for it, slowly, carefully. My hand was shaking, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. The screen lit up, but this time the message wasn't from me. It was different. The letters twisted on the screen, scrambled, like they were trying to form words but couldn't. I couldn't understand what it said, but I felt it, deep in my bones, the message was meant for me. You are here. You are part of this now. I felt the room spin. The walls seemed to close in on me, and for the first time, I thought I might actually lose my mind. I dropped the phone and stumbled back, my legs shaking. It fell to the floor with a clatter, but it didn't stop. The buzzing that seemed to vibrate through the very air, through my skin. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not from the phone, but from behind me. I turned, my heart slamming in my chest, but the room was still empty. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door, I stopped. My eyes flicked to the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. There, standing in the dark, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, the figure stepped forward. It was me. Not the me that stood frozen in front of the door, but the me from the screen. The me that spoke those words, that left those messages. The me that had been calling, whispering, haunting. Her eyes were empty. Hollow. As if they had seen too much, felt too much. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. You should never have listened, she said, her voice like the one from the phone. Her lips didn't move. Her voice came from everywhere. It filled the room, surrounding me. It was in my mind, in my soul, echoing in the deepest parts of me. I backed away, shaking my head, but I knew deep down it was too late. It was too late for me. It was too late for all of us. I stumbled toward the door, but the figure followed, moving without a sound, gliding through the air. She didn't walk. She didn't need to. She was part of the darkness, part of the voice, part of the nightmare that had already begun. You can't leave. You've never been able to leave, she whispered, her cold fingers brushing against my skin as she drew closer. I screamed, a sound that echoed in my ears, but it was drowned out by the buzzing of the phone. The noise, the voice, the presence, it was all around me, suffocating me. I tried to run, but my legs didn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place. I closed my eyes, praying for it to end, but when I opened them again, she was right in front of me. The other me. The one I couldn't escape. And then, she smiled. It was a smile that wasn't hers. It was a smile that wasn't mine. I was lost. I had always been lost. I was never going to escape. And as the darkness consumed me, the last thing I heard was her voice, my voice, whispering one final, chilling truth. We're together now. Forever. The world had turned dark. I don't know if it was the phone or if it was something far worse, something that reached beyond the confines of the technology, but it had consumed me. The figure, me, had smiled, and with that smile, everything changed. The room, the apartment, the city outside, it all dissolved into nothing. I wasn't sure if I was still breathing, if my body was still tethered to this world, or if I had crossed over into something else. Something darker. The silence was deafening. Or maybe it wasn't silence at all. Maybe the buzzing was still there, always there, just beyond the edge of perception. It was like a low hum that shook my very bones, an omnipresent sound that followed me into whatever space I was trapped in. I couldn't remember how long I'd been standing in that room, unable to move, unable to speak. Time didn't exist anymore. The clock on the wall had stopped, the phone had stopped buzzing, but I could still hear it, in the back of my mind, taunting me. It wasn't over. I could feel it. The voice was still there. We're together now. Forever. Was that the truth? Was I always meant to hear that voice? Was it always me, speaking to myself from somewhere deep inside? I looked down, and the phone was still there. Still in my hand, still waiting for me to press that button. To listen. To hear the message. But I couldn't. I couldn't bear to hear it anymore. I had already listened too many times. Too many messages, too many whispers. It was my voice, but it wasn't me. I stumbled back toward the door, but it wasn't the door anymore. It was just a shadow, a dark hole in the wall, like the room itself had been swallowed by something darker, something deeper. I reached out toward the void, but before I could touch it, a new sound filled the air. A train whistle. Distant at first, but growing louder. Closer. My breath caught in my throat as the sound of the train grew closer, more urgent. I looked around, but there was nothing. No tracks, no train, just empty space and that suffocating buzzing. The whistle echoed again, but this time it wasn't just the sound of the train. It was the voice, distorted, like it was calling from the very depths of the earth. Calling to me. Calling from the phone. Calling from inside. And I realized then, in that moment of pure clarity, that the train would never stop. It would never reach its destination. It was a train that had been derailed long ago, but it never stopped running. It would always come for me. It would always be there. Just like the voice. Just like her. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't meant to escape. Maybe this was the beginning of something else. Something far worse. The phone buzzed again. The same message. The same voice. It's too late. You're one of us now. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I felt the darkness envelop me. The voice. The phone. The train. It was all the same. It was all me. Forever. It started as an ordinary evening. The kind where the streets are calm and the air is crisp with the fading light of dusk. I was walking home from work, my footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk. The city seemed unusually quiet, with most people already tucked away in their homes. As I passed the old bookstore, I noticed something, a shadow lingering a few steps behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. The city is full of people, and it's not uncommon for someone to walk at a similar pace. But then, I realized something strange. The shadow never got closer. It stayed just behind me, maintaining a consistent distance, no matter how fast or slow I walked. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just an empty street behind me, bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe I was subconsciously aware of my own solitude. I turned a corner and continued walking, but the feeling lingered. It felt like I wasn't alone. Like someone, or something, was watching me from a distance. I tried to shake off the sensation, focusing on the sound of my own footsteps. But then, I heard it, the faintest rustling of shoes on pavement, the soft shuffle of someone moving just behind me. I turned again, this time more deliberately, but once more, the street was empty. The sound stopped, and there was no sign of anyone. My heart started to race. There was no one, but I could feel the presence. I quickened my pace, my footsteps growing louder in the silence. The rustling started again, faint but unmistakable. I dared not look over my shoulder this time. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something far more unnerving. I reached a well-lit part of the street, and for a brief moment, I thought I might be safe. The street lights were bright here, and it seemed less likely that I could be followed without being seen. But then, as I passed the glass display of a nearby store, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. It was him. The man who had been following me. He was standing just behind me in the reflection, staring right at me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could still feel him, though. He was there, in the reflection, but not in reality. My reflection showed his face, a pale, emotionless figure with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through me. It was as if he was waiting for something, or maybe for me to notice him. I stopped walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't move. He just stood there, perfectly still, matching my every motion, but never stepping into the real world. He stayed in the reflection. I took a step back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was I losing my mind? Or was there something more to this? I turned away quickly, walking faster, my mind racing as I tried to process the impossible situation. But even as I moved away from the store, I could still feel his presence, watching from the corner of my eye, always just behind me. I kept walking, now almost running, my pulse quickening. Each step echoed in the stillness of the street, and yet the rustling of shoes continued, as though someone was keeping pace with me. I glanced up ahead and saw a familiar alley. Maybe if I took a different route, I could lose him. I couldn't stand the idea of him following me any longer. I darted into the alley, my breath ragged, the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest as I turned sharply, desperate to put distance between us. But when I reached the end of the alley and looked back, there he was again, his reflection in the window of an old, abandoned shop. He had followed me in, even though I was sure I hadn't hurt him. It was as if he was tethered to me, a shadow that wouldn't leave, no matter how far I ran or how fast I moved. The reflection of the man smiled. And I realized, too late, that it wasn't just the reflection that was watching me. I took a step back, my body trembling, as I stared at the reflection of the man. His smile was wide now, almost mocking, as if he were enjoying my panic. His eyes, however, remained cold, empty, as if there was nothing human about him at all. He hadn't moved in the reflection, yet I could feel the oppressive weight of his presence closing in around me. I turned away, quickly walking down the alley again, my eyes darting around. The street was silent, the only sounds my breath and hurried footsteps. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Could it be some trick of the light? A reflection that was somehow delayed? But that smile, the way he was always there, never truly following, just mirroring my every move, felt wrong. It felt impossible. As I emerged from the alley, I dared not look at the glass windows again. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I quickened my pace, willing myself to reach home. The familiar streets seemed different now, like a maze of shadow and distortion. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. It wasn't until I reached a corner, just a block from my apartment, that I heard it again, the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. But this time, they were louder, more deliberate. I couldn't ignore it. Someone was following me, and it wasn't just in the reflection anymore. I spun around, my pulse racing, but there was no one there. Just the empty sidewalk. I felt my chest tighten, the air suddenly thick and suffocating. I didn't know where he was, but I could sense him, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I broke into a sprint, desperate to reach the safety of my apartment. The sound of my breath mixed with the echo of those footsteps behind me. They weren't mine. They were slower, heavier. The more I ran, the closer the footsteps seemed to get, though they were still just out of sight. I reached the building, gasping for air, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I managed to unlock the door and stumble inside, slamming it shut behind me. My body leaned against the door as if trying to hold the world outside at bay. I was safe. I had to be. But the feeling of his presence lingered, just as it always did. Like a dark cloud hanging over me, suffocating and relentless. The apartment was silent. Too silent. I stood there, listening, waiting for something, anything. But there was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. I walked to the window, peering out through the blinds. The street below seemed as empty as ever. But when I looked at the window across the street, my blood ran cold. There he was again. The man, standing perfectly still, staring up at me through the reflection of the opposite building. His dark eyes locked onto mine as if he knew exactly where I was, and he was waiting. The reflection was clearer now, more pronounced. He was no longer a mere silhouette. I could see his features in sharp detail, the hollow cheeks, the thin lips, the sharpness in his eyes. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the suffocating pressure of being watched. I backed away from the window, my heart thumping in my chest. What did he want? Why was he following me? And why could he only appear in reflections? I sank to the floor, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't stop shaking. My mind was spinning with questions, but there were no answers. I couldn't understand it, couldn't make sense of any of it. All I knew was that I was trapped, not just by the man who was stalking me, but by the inexplicable terror that seemed to have taken over my life. Hours passed. I stayed in my apartment, too afraid to venture outside, too afraid to look at any reflective surface. I had seen enough to know that he wasn't just an illusion. He wasn't just some trick of light or shadow. There was something real about him, something terrifying. But as the night wore on, the sounds outside faded and the oppressive stillness returned. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew the truth. The man wasn't going to stop. He would be back. And this time, he might not just stay in the reflection. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Every creak of the building made me jump, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. The thought of stepping into the street again, of facing that man, made my skin crawl. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, but I couldn't shake the image of his cold, empty eyes. They haunted me, always just behind me, always watching, waiting for the right moment. And then, as I drifted off into a restless sleep, I heard it again. The faint shuffle of footsteps. Closer this time. I shot upright in bed, heart hammering in my chest. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and I felt the blood rush to my ears, drowning out everything else. The footsteps were real. They were right outside my door now. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I could hear the soft scrape of shoes on the hallway floor, slow, deliberate, as if the person outside was savoring my fear. My body was frozen, the tension so thick I could almost taste it in the air. I waited, every second stretching into an eternity, until the footsteps finally stopped. But there was no knock. No call. Just silence. A suffocating silence that pressed down on me, filling the room with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I wanted to get up, to check if anyone was really there, but my body wouldn't move. It was as though I had been paralyzed, trapped inside my own fear. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I knew deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't human. It couldn't be. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, any sign of movement, a sound that would tell me what was happening. But the silence stretched on, unbearable in its stillness. And then, just as I thought I might suffocate from the tension, I heard a soft tap on the door. It was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. A single, hollow knock. Almost as if it were testing to see if I was awake. I felt a chill run down my spine, my blood turning to ice. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound, couldn't even breathe. The knock repeated, this time louder, sharper. My mind raced, and I tried to think of something, anything, to do. But there was nothing. No plan. No escape. The door handle turned. It wasn't a violent shake. It wasn't even rushed. It was slow, measured, like the person on the other side had all the time in the world to make their move. My body was a statue. My mind was screaming at me to get up, to run, to do something, but my limbs refused to obey. I just sat there, eyes wide, staring at the door as it creaked open. The gap between the door and its frame grew wider, but I didn't dare look. I couldn't. And then, through the crack, I heard a voice. "Are you going to let me in?" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it, something unsettling. The kind of voice that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It wasn't familiar, but somehow, it felt like it should be. It felt like it belonged in this room, in this place. It was as if it had always been here. I pressed myself back into the bed, trying to make myself as small as possible, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I would fade away into the darkness. But the voice came again, a little louder this time, insistent. "Let me in. I'm right here." I closed my eyes, my hands trembling, and I whispered to myself, over and over, that it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. This was just a nightmare, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the voice, it sounded so real. Too real. I knew I couldn't stay in the room forever. Eventually, I would have to face whatever was waiting outside. But I couldn't bring myself to move, to open my eyes, to even acknowledge that the door was open. It felt like if I did, something would happen. Something worse. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like a century. Then, just as I thought I might go mad from the silence, I heard a sound. The door closed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was almost soft, as if the person had come in, but hadn't made a sound. I felt my breath catch in my throat, and for the first time that night, I dared to open my eyes. The room was empty. The door was fully closed, the room just as I had left it. But I could feel it, the presence, the thing that had been there with me. I wasn't alone anymore. I stood up slowly, my legs weak beneath me, my knees threatening to buckle. I didn't know what I was expecting, but the emptiness in the room felt even worse than the footsteps, the knocks, the voice. It was as if whatever had been following me, whatever had been watching me, was now inside with me. I moved cautiously to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I had to know if anyone was there. I had to know what was happening. But as I touched the knob, I heard it again. The voice. "I told you I was here." It was behind me. So close, I could feel the cold breath on my neck. But when I turned around, the room was still empty. The silence was deafening, the kind that makes your ears ring with the absence of sound. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror across the room, there, standing behind me, was the man. But this time, he wasn't just a shadow. He was real, solid, his face twisted into that same cold smile. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I realized something that chilled me to the core. The man wasn't following me anymore. He was me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My body felt as though it were moving in slow motion, my breath a shallow gasp as I tried to comprehend what I had just seen. The reflection in the mirror, that man, that thing, was me. But not me. It was like a twisted version of myself, distorted, warped in ways I couldn't explain. I blinked, hoping it was some kind of trick. But when I opened my eyes, it was still there. Standing behind me. Just staring. I turned away from the mirror, desperately trying to shake the image from my mind. But I couldn't escape the feeling of those eyes on me, those empty eyes. I felt a coldness creeping over me, an unnatural chill that I couldn't shake off. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, praying that it would somehow make everything feel normal again. But when I unlocked the screen, there it was. A new message. I told you I was here. It was a text, sent from my own number. My blood ran cold. My pulse quickened. The words seemed to burn into my eyes as I stared at the screen, unable to tear my gaze away. This couldn't be real. There was no way. This wasn't possible. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had to do something. I had to figure out what was happening, how this nightmare was unfolding. I quickly dialed my best friend, hoping that hearing a familiar voice would ground me. But as the phone rang, the sound of it reverberated through the empty room, making the silence feel even more suffocating. It went to voicemail. I cursed under my breath. Of course. I couldn't even get in touch with anyone. I was completely alone, trapped in this waking nightmare with no way out. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The longer I stood there, the more the room seemed to grow darker, the corners swallowing up the light, the air thick with a palpable sense of unease. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, footsteps. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The floorboards creaked under the weight of slow, deliberate steps. They were coming closer, closer, until they stopped. My breath caught in my chest. I turned, eyes wide with panic, only to find that the room was still empty. The door was still shut, the shadows still clinging to the corners. There was no one there. No one except me. I didn't want to look again. I didn't want to see that reflection, that twisted version of myself staring back. But my gaze was drawn to the mirror, like it was pulling me in, like it had a power over me that I couldn't resist. I took a step toward it, almost against my will. I reached out a shaking hand, my fingers brushing the cool surface of the glass. And there he was. That man. I was standing there again. But this time, something was different. The reflection wasn't just standing still. It was moving. It was smiling. The smile wasn't the one I knew. It was colder, sharper, something sinister. The reflection's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it felt like they were staring through me, not at me. As if it was seeing my very soul. My stomach churned, and my knees buckled beneath me, forcing me to collapse onto the floor. I couldn't look away. I couldn't do anything but stare at the image of myself in the mirror. But then, the reflection moved. It raised a hand, and I did the same, unable to control my own actions. The movement was synchronized, exact. But there was a delay. My reflection moved just a fraction of a second after I did. I stood frozen, watching in horror as my reflection's smile widened, the corners of its lips stretching unnaturally far. It was mocking me. It was me, but it wasn't. It was something else, something wrong. I stumbled back from the mirror, my head spinning, the room closing in around me. The footsteps started again, slow, deliberate, echoing in the silence. But this time, they weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from behind me. It was getting closer. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear, my legs weak and unsteady. I felt the cold breath on my neck before I heard it, the voice, low and chilling. "You can't escape me." I turned, but there was no one there. The room was empty again, the silence almost deafening. But I knew it was there. It was right behind me, its presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake off. I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever this was swallowed me whole. But as I reached for the door, I heard the voice again, this time clear and unmistakable. "You're not going anywhere." I froze. I hadn't heard it from behind me. This time, the voice came from inside my own head. It was as if the thing that had been following me was now inside me, speaking from the depths of my mind. The reflection in the mirror, the one that wasn't me, was still there, still watching. And I realized, with a sickening clarity, that it was never just following me. It was becoming me. I could barely breathe. My chest was tight, my heart racing. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with dread. I had to get out, I had to leave, but no matter which way I turned, the feeling of that presence, the thing that wasn't me, was everywhere. It had always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting. I reached for the door again, my hand shaking as I turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, a sound that felt unnervingly loud in the stillness of the room. But when I stepped into the hallway, it felt wrong. The familiar hallway of my apartment, the one I passed 1,000 times, was different. The walls seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The air felt colder, like it was pulling me in, like it was alive. Every step I took was met with the echo of my own footsteps, the sound stretching out unnaturally long. And still, I could hear it. The voice. It was inside me now. "You can't run from me." I spun around, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing. No one. The hallway was empty. The silence was deafening. And yet, the presence was so strong, it felt like it was wrapping around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. What was happening? How had this thing taken control? Was it my reflection? Or was it something else entirely, something that had always been there, just waiting for me to notice? I had to get away. I had to escape, but I didn't know where to go. There was no safe place. Not anymore. The reflection had followed me out of the mirror, had followed me into my thoughts. There was no escape. No way out. I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were right behind me, so close I could feel the cold breath on the back of my neck. I whirled around, but there was nothing. No one. And then I saw it. In the hallway mirror, the reflection stood there, me, but not me. The thing that had been haunting me. Its eyes glowed, the smile stretched unnaturally wide. It was watching me, but it wasn't me anymore. It was something else, something that had taken over. I reached out, drawn to it, unable to stop myself. My fingers brushed the glass, and for a moment, I could have sworn I felt its cold, clammy skin. But when I pulled my hand back, I saw the reflection's fingers move. It mimicked my every move, but it was slower, more deliberate. It was waiting for me to let it in. I pulled my hand away from the mirror, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to escape. I couldn't let it take over. Not now. But as I turned to run, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. It was moving. Not from the mirror, not from any reflection, but from the room itself. The man, the thing, it was in the hallway. My body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my mind a blur of panic. It took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. And then it spoke, its voice low and cold, vibrating through my bones. You've always been mine. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat. I couldn't escape. There was no way out. I backed into the wall, my eyes wide with terror. The thing was getting closer. Every step it took sent a chill through me, a feeling like I was being pulled into a void, into something dark and endless. And then I saw it. The reflection in the hallway mirror, it was smiling. It was me, but it wasn't. It had taken my place. It was me, but worse. The face in the mirror didn't blink, didn't move, just grinned at me with that horrible, twisted smile. I reached out for the door, desperate to escape, but the reflection's hand shot out of the glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear, by the weight of something far worse than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just following me. It was taking me. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash. And then, silence. The reflection was gone. The hallway was empty. And I was alone. But I knew it wasn't over. I could still hear the footsteps in my mind. I could still feel it watching me. It wasn't finished with me yet. I had survived. But I had lost. And whatever it was still out there, waiting. Still becoming me. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be completely alone, surrounded by darkness, and not knowing if you'll ever see the light again? I used to think about it as a passing fear, something that couldn't really happen. But that night, in the subway, I learned how real it could be. I was on my usual evening ride home. The train was packed, as it always was at this hour. People were buried in their phones, some chatting quietly, others nodding off in their seats. The buzz of muffled conversations and the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels were oddly soothing. It felt normal. Too normal. But that's the thing about the city, everything seems so predictable until it isn't. The train slowed down, as it always did before it reached the next station. But it didn't stop. It just kept creeping forward, slower and slower, until finally it came to a complete halt. There was an unsettling silence, a pause that stretched too long. The lights flickered once, then went out. At first, no one said anything. People adjusted, fumbled for their phones, their light sources, but even with the glow of screens, the darkness felt deeper than usual. I could hear the soft hum of the train, the whir of the air conditioning. But that was it. Silence. And then the faintest sound, the sound of footsteps, echoed from somewhere far down the tunnel. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. A low, rhythmic sound, like someone walking, slowly, steadily, as if they were waiting for something. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from, but I couldn't tell. It wasn't like the train was moving, and no one else seemed to notice. They were too preoccupied with their own discomfort in the dark. A few minutes passed, and I started to feel uneasy. That sound. It was still there. Louder now, closer. Was it a person walking? Or something else? I looked around. No one else seemed bothered. A few murmured complaints about the power outage, but nothing more. People were used to delays. But not like this. Not in a pitch-black tunnel with no word from the conductor. No reason for the lights to go out. Nothing made sense. The train didn't move. I stood up, my mind racing. Was this just a technical glitch, or was something else happening? The doors of the train were closed. There was no way out. I paced up and down the aisle, trying to shake off the growing sense of panic creeping over me. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Closer this time. A man was walking toward the train. But how could that be? The train had stopped in the middle of the tunnel. The tracks outside were supposed to be empty. I was about to move closer to the window to peer outside when the lights flickered again. Then, just as suddenly as they had gone out, the lights came back on. The train jolted forward with a sharp sound, and I grabbed onto the nearest seat to steady myself. But what I saw through the window made my blood run cold. There was nothing. No one. Just the faint glow of the station lights far in the distance. No figure. No one walking. I took a deep breath and sat back down, trying to calm myself. It was probably nothing. Probably just a strange glitch, maybe someone trying to fix the system in the tunnel. But as the train moved forward, the unease never left. And that's when it started. One by one, people began to disappear. At first, it was small. A person would shift in their seat, and then, in the next blink, they were gone. No one noticed, not even the people sitting next to them. The train car was starting to feel emptier, but I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. My heart began to race. Another flicker of light, and then another person, gone. This time, I saw it. The empty seat. No sign of the person who had been sitting there just seconds ago. But it didn't stop. It kept happening, over and over, each time without a sound. No one else seemed to notice, but I couldn't ignore it. Where were they going? What was happening? Was this part of the malfunction, or was something more sinister at play? I couldn't understand it. People just disappeared. But the footsteps, the ones I had heard earlier, grew louder. And now they were moving up and down the aisles. Then I saw it, through the darkened door of the train, an outline, a shadow. Something was watching us. Something was hunting us. And then, as if on cue, the train lurched to another stop. The doors opened, but no one came in, and no one left. Just the sound of breathing, heavy, ragged breaths, and the smell, something metallic, sickly sweet, like iron. I was the only one left in the car. The doors stayed open for what felt like an eternity. I could see the dim lights of the station flickering in the distance, but there was no movement, no one waiting to board, no one leaving. The silence was suffocating. The breathing I had heard was now louder, closer, and I could feel it, an unseen presence that seemed to fill the train car with an oppressive weight. I glanced around the train, hoping to see someone, anyone else. But the seats were empty. I had no idea when the last person had disappeared. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. The train remained stationary, the silence stretching on like an endless void. Then, just as I was about to reach for my phone, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. I was plunged into complete darkness, and for a moment, I couldn't hear anything but my own breath. The footsteps had stopped, and the oppressive feeling of being watched remained, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, praying for the comforting glow of its screen. But the screen remained black, no signal, no light. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, like a breeze brushing against my ear. But it grew louder, clearer. A voice, low, guttural, and somehow wrong. It wasn't speaking to me directly, but it was as if the words were being whispered just out of reach, like an echo in the back of my mind. Get off. I froze, my blood running cold. I had no idea where the voice was coming from, but I knew one thing for certain, it wasn't human. The train jerked slightly, and I realized I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay in the dark, in this empty train. Something was happening, and I wasn't sure if I was going to survive it. The doors were still open, but I hesitated. Should I get off? Would it be any safer out there? The thought of walking through the dark tunnel alone with whatever was out there made my skin crawl. But the alternative, the claustrophobic, suffocating train, seemed just as dangerous. Another flicker of light, and this time I saw something. A shadow, just at the edge of the doorframe. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and for a second, I could swear I saw it move. Then the lights went out again, and I was left in complete blackness. The whisper came again, closer this time, more urgent. Get off. It was now or never. I couldn't wait anymore. I bolted toward the door, my heart racing. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stumbled toward the gap between the train and the platform, my feet scraping against the floor. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, but I forced myself to take another step forward. And then, just as I reached the edge, the lights flickered back on. For a split second, I saw it clearly. The figure, standing just outside the train, its face obscured by shadows. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its body slumped in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It was watching me. Before I could react, the doors slammed shut with a deafening noise, trapping me inside. I scrambled to press the button to open them again, but it didn't work. The train began to move, jerking forward with an unsettling speed. The whispering voice had stopped. But the footsteps were still there, echoing in the tunnel. I backed away from the doors, trying to keep my distance from the shadow outside. It was following me. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that the train wasn't just going forward. It was taking me somewhere. Somewhere I didn't want to be. The train rattled through the tunnel, its wheels screeching against the track. The sounds around me grew louder, more distorted. The rhythmic clattering of the train was joined by a chorus of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was walking alongside the train, keeping pace. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, the fear rising like a tidal wave. I needed to get off. I needed to escape. But with each passing second, the walls of the train car felt smaller, more suffocating. The voice came again, but this time it was inside my head. "You're not leaving." I whipped around, but there was no one there. No one but the empty seats, the flickering lights, and the dark tunnel stretching on ahead. The train wasn't stopping. I was alone. Or was I? I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no shadow in the doorway. No figure standing there. But I could feel its presence. The feeling of being watched. It was closer now, creeping up behind me. I turned quickly, my breath coming in short gasps, and there, standing at the far end of the car, was the figure. It was taller than before. Its face was still obscured, but I could see the outline of its body, stretched and distorted, like it didn't belong in this world. And then it moved. The train lurched again, and I felt the weight of the shadow pressing closer, inching toward me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out. But the doors wouldn't open. They wouldn't open, and the shadow was getting closer. And then I realized, with horror, that the shadow wasn't just on the train with me. It was part of the train. The darkness. It had been with me the whole time. It was closing in. And there was no escape. The train plunged deeper into the tunnel, the flickering lights giving only brief glimpses of the terror that waited in the shadows. I could feel it, the presence, always just out of sight but never truly gone. My heart pounded, my mind screaming for escape, but there was nowhere to run. The walls of the train car felt like they were closing in, constricting, suffocating. I pressed my back to the cold metal of the train, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed through the car, and I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone. The figure had not left. It was still with me, following, waiting. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, taller. My eyes darted toward the darkened windows, hoping to find some sign of light, some sign of safety, but all I saw was the endless tunnel, a tunnel that seemed to go on forever, swallowing any hope of escape. Then, just as I was about to break, a harsh sound cut through the silence, the sharp screech of metal on metal. The train jolted violently, throwing me off balance. I stumbled forward, my hands slamming against the walls to steady myself, and for a brief moment, the screeching stopped. But the silence that followed was worse. It was as if the entire world had gone still. I looked toward the door. The shadow, it was gone. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself to believe that it was over, that whatever had been following me had finally disappeared. But the feeling of being watched didn't vanish. If anything, it grew stronger. Something was waiting just beyond the door, waiting for me to make a move. I slowly stepped away from the door, my eyes scanning the car. There was no sign of the figure, but I could feel the tension building. The train was no longer moving smoothly. It was as if it had slowed down, dragging itself through the darkness, reluctant to continue. Then, I heard it. A whisper, so faint I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. "Stay." I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had whispered before, the one that had told me to get off. But now it was different. It was clearer, more commanding. The darkness outside the train seemed to press in on me, its weight unbearable. I turned to the window again, my eyes frantically searching for any sign of light. But instead, I saw something moving, something large and dark, crawling along the tracks outside the train. The figure. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. It was impossible. There was no way it could be there, outside the train, but there it was, moving at a slow, deliberate pace, just out of reach. and with each passing second, it seemed to grow closer. I backed away from the window, my hands fumbling for anything to hold on to. The car was empty, except for me, and yet I could feel the presence of someone, waiting, watching. The whispering voice came again, closer this time, its words wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. "You can't leave." I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the overwhelming silence. The train groaned, its metal frame screeching again as it continued its slow crawl through the tunnel. The figure outside was moving faster now, its form more defined, more tangible. Its limbs were elongated, its movements jerky, unnatural. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the feeling of dread that flooded my chest told me otherwise. I was trapped, caught in this dark, endless tunnel, with no way out. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for the shadow to consume me. I reached for the emergency brake, but my fingers were numb, trembling too violently to make contact. The train lurched again, this time more violently, as though it had been struck by something. The lights flickered, then went out completely. The darkness was absolute. For a split second, I thought I might have lost my mind. The shadows pressed in from all sides, suffocating, consuming. I felt my pulse quicken, panic rising in my chest. I was in a nightmare, a dream I couldn't wake from. And then I heard the sound. It was the unmistakable noise of something crawling, dragging itself across the floor of the train. The sound was grotesque, like something heavy scraping against the metal, growing closer, louder with each passing second. I turned in desperation, searching for any way to escape. The door, was it still locked? I couldn't tell. I tried to pull the emergency lever again, but my hand wouldn't move. It felt as if something was holding me in place, rooting me to the spot. The sound was right behind me now. I could feel the air shift, cold and unnatural, as if something was breathing just inches away. My body went cold with fear. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it breathing, but I could feel it, its presence, just behind me. And then, with a sickening thud, something heavy slammed into the door, rattling the entire train. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. It was the shadow. Its long, twisted form filled the doorway, blocking out all light, leaving only the feeling of suffocating darkness in its wake. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. "Stay." And I knew I couldn't fight it. The shadow had caught me, and there was no escape from the nightmare I had found myself in. But then, something unexpected happened. The train screeched to a halt. The lights flickered back on, and I blinked against the harsh brightness. The shadow was gone. I stood there, frozen, my heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. The train was still. No more scraping sounds, no more whispers. It was as if the nightmare had ended. But when I looked out the window, there it was. The figure, standing at the edge of the tracks, watching me. And it wasn't alone. I realized, with a chill crawling down my spine, that there were more of them. More shadows, standing silent, waiting. And I wasn't alone anymore. I turned away from the window, my body shaking. The cold air that had been suffocating me now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. My eyes darted around the car, empty again, except for me. But the air was thick, filled with something I couldn't place. It was like the atmosphere itself had changed, had shifted in a way that made the train feel even more claustrophobic. The lights flickered again, but this time, they didn't just fade. They buzzed, flickered, and then steadied, casting a cold, sterile light across the car. I was still breathing heavily, each breath short and shallow, as if I were underwater. The figure outside was still there, its silhouette now more distinct, clearer than before, but it hadn't moved. It just stood there, watching. I felt a knot form in my stomach. What did it want? Why was it following me? I couldn't make sense of it. There was no logical explanation for any of this. But the fear was real. The fear gnawed at my insides, eating away at whatever sanity I had left. I pressed my back against the cold window, my hands trembling. My reflection stared back at me, pale, wide-eyed, as if I were already a ghost trapped in this nightmare. I reached out instinctively to touch the glass, but the coldness stopped me with its biting chill. "Stay," the voice echoed again, this time much clearer and much closer. I whipped around, but there was no one behind me. Nothing. I was alone in the car. But the words were still there, lingering, hanging in the air like smoke. They crawled into my mind, wrapping themselves around my thoughts, smothering them. Stay. Stay. But I couldn't. I had to get out. I had to leave. The train lurched forward suddenly, snapping me out of my trance. I stumbled, gripping the nearest pole for balance. The train was moving again, but the speed was strange. It didn't feel right. It wasn't the smooth, steady motion of a normal journey. It was jerky, uneven, like it was dragging itself along the tracks. The lights above flickered in and out again, and with each flicker, the darkness outside seemed to creep closer, as if it were alive, crawling toward me. I glanced toward the doors, the sense of urgency pressing down on me. If I could just get off, get away from this train, from whatever it was that was following me. The idea of being trapped in here with no escape, with the shadows outside watching, it was suffocating. I moved toward the door, my feet unsteady, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the cold metal handle. I pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic surged through me. I yanked harder, but the door remained firmly shut. I turned back to look through the window. The figure was still there, but now it was closer. So close I could almost make out its features. The shadowed form was tall, unnaturally so, and it stood still, not moving an inch. But something was different. There was a slight distortion in the air around it, like the world itself was bending. The edges of the figure seemed to ripple, twist, as if it were not entirely real. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I backed away from the door, my breath coming in rapid gasps. Suddenly, a loud bang sounded from somewhere deep in the train. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was so violent, so jarring, it felt like the whole train had been struck by something outside. I whipped my head around, I scanning the car for any sign of movement. Nothing. But then, the whispers started. Soft at first, like a distant murmur, but they grew louder, more insistent. "Stay," they said, over and over, as if trying to seep into my mind, to break me. The lights above me flickered again, and then, for the briefest of moments, they went out completely. The train plunged into complete darkness. For a long, terrifying second, I stood frozen. The whispers, the breathing of unseen figures, it was all too much. I could feel the darkness around me, pressing against my skin, pushing me to the edge of sanity. Then the lights came back on, casting everything in a harsh, sterile glow. The train had stopped again, and I could feel it, the presence of something wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I realized with a jolt that I couldn't hear the usual sounds of the train anymore. There were no faint humming noises, no vibration beneath my feet. It was as though the train had become dead, silent, suspended in time. The windows outside were now completely dark, void of any light. I couldn't see the tracks, couldn't see anything beyond the glass. The world had been swallowed by the blackness. I took a tentative step forward, my legs heavy, my body refusing to move faster than a crawl. Each step felt like I was being drawn deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then, just as I was about to reach for the emergency button, something in the distance caught my eye. A figure. Not outside. Not in the tunnel. Inside. It was standing at the far end of the train car, just beyond the shadows. It was watching me, unmoving, its face obscured by the darkness. Its presence filled the entire space, and I knew it wasn't human. It was something else. Something that had been waiting, watching, all this time. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't look away. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing: I had to get out of here, or it would be the end of me. I turned toward the doors again, trying the handle once more. But the metal was now warm, almost burning hot against my palm. And then the train moved again, this time faster, as if something had jolted it into motion. I stumbled, falling to the floor as the train surged forward into the dark, toward an unknown destination. And with each passing second, the figure in the back of the car moved closer. Closer. Until it was right behind me. I could feel it now, its presence, like ice crawling down my spine. My heart hammered in my chest, my blood pounding in my ears. I couldn't bring myself to look. I knew that if I did, if I dared to turn my head, I'd see it, right behind me, inches from my skin. The air in the train car felt thick and wrong, suffocating. My limbs were frozen, each movement sluggish, as if my body was rebelling against the fear consuming me. The train rumbled, picking up speed, the wheels screeching against the track, but it didn't feel like I was moving forward. It felt as though we were being pulled deeper into the darkness, into some place that didn't belong to the real world anymore. A place where the laws of nature had been twisted, bent beyond recognition. I couldn't breathe. The smell of stale air and metal grew overwhelming, stinging my nostrils. My skin felt clammy, slick with sweat, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the train's relentless motion and the rising panic in my chest. And then, the whisper came again. Stay. It was closer this time, too close. A breath, soft and cold against my ear, and I felt my heart stop for a second. I didn't want to turn. I couldn't. But I knew. I knew that if I didn't, it would be the end. Whatever it was behind me, it wasn't waiting anymore. It was getting closer, moving with a slowness that stretched the seconds into eternity. I forced myself to move. My legs screamed in protest as I pushed myself toward the emergency exit, desperate to escape. My hands fumbled over the emergency lever, slipping against the cold metal. I could hear the breath of the figure now, steady, too steady, just behind me. Its presence was suffocating, filling the small space, making it feel like the walls were closing in. With a final, frantic yank, I managed to pull the lever. The door to the outside world creaked open, and for a moment, I saw nothing but darkness, the abyss that stretched beyond the train. But as I took a step toward the door, I froze. There was a figure standing outside, on the tracks, blocking the way. It was tall, far taller than a human should be, its form shifting in the dim light of the train. It was the same figure I had seen earlier, but now it was fully visible. The twisted limbs, the contorted, unnatural shape, it was no longer hiding in the shadows. It had come into the light, and I saw it clearly now. Its face, if you could call it a face, was a grotesque mask of darkness, a hollow void that seemed to suck in the light around it, leaving nothing but an endless abyss where eyes should have been. Its mouth was stretched wide, impossibly wide, with jagged, sharp teeth gleaming in the dark. But it wasn't the face that terrified me the most. It was the way it moved. It moved with no sound, no footsteps, no rustling of clothes. It simply glided toward me, as if the air itself were bending to its will. I stepped back, panic flooding my veins, my legs refusing to move any further. The train, once a lifeline, now felt like a prison, its interior closing in on me. The creature outside didn't hurry. It didn't need to. It was in no rush. It knew it had me trapped. And then the whispers came again, louder this time, filling my head, drowning out all rational thought. Stay with us. I shook my head, backing away from the door. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost, choked by the oppressive silence. The train car was still moving, still pushing forward, but the sound of the wheels on the tracks had stopped. It was as if the train had come to a standstill, frozen in time, caught between two worlds. I turned toward the other end of the train, but it was too late. The shadow, the figure from before, was already there, blocking my escape. It had moved without making a sound. It had crossed the entire length of the train in the blink of an eye, and now it stood before me, its shape growing more monstrous, more distorted, until I could barely comprehend it as something human. I could feel its breath on my face, cold, like the touch of death itself. It leaned closer, its form warping, folding in on itself, and then, in a voice that wasn't a voice but a pressure inside my skull, it whispered, "Stay." The word wrapped around me like a suffocating coil, pulling me in, binding me to the train. I felt my body go numb, my mind clouded, my will breaking. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. And then, as if the world had stopped spinning, I realized something. The darkness wasn't just outside the train. It was inside, too. The train car was becoming part of it, the walls shifting, warping, as if the reality itself were being torn apart. The shadows that had once seemed so far away were now all around me, crawling up the walls, reaching out with long, twisted fingers. The train was no longer a machine, it was a tomb, a place where time had no meaning and death had no form. I closed my eyes, the whispers becoming a cacophony, a deafening roar inside my head. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't escape. But I wasn't alone. The shadows were all around me now, filling every inch of space. And as the last flicker of light died in the train, I felt my mind slip away, consumed by the darkness. The train had become a part of the void, and I was lost in it forever. Have you ever found something that didn't belong to you? Something that felt so familiar, yet utterly wrong? Something that stirred an uncomfortable sense of déjà vu, as if you had seen it before in another life, another time? That's what happened to me the afternoon I found the backpack in the park. It was lying there, just off the main path, half hidden beneath a tree. At first, I thought it was just another forgotten bag, abandoned by a careless passerby. But something about it made me stop. The faded fabric, the worn zippers, it seemed older than anything that should be left behind in a busy city park. I walked closer, drawn by a strange curiosity. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground, and the park, usually so full of life, now seemed eerily quiet. My footsteps were the only sound, a dull echo on the pavement. I knelt beside the bag, eyeing it cautiously. The park was nearly empty now. A few joggers passed by in the distance, but no one was near. I reached out and touched the zipper. It was stiff, almost as if it had been closed for years. Slowly, I pulled it open. Inside, there were a few old items, a cracked thermos, a couple of half-empty notebooks, and a bundle of photographs wrapped in rubber bands. I picked them up, noticing the faint smell of old paper and something else, something I couldn't quite place. The photos were yellowed with age, the edges curling slightly. They were old family photos, black and white images of smiling people at picnics, children playing in front of a house I didn't recognize, adults standing around a table laden with food. But there was something wrong. In every photo, there were faces I didn't recognize, strangers. People who weren't in any of the photos I had ever seen from my own family. The strange thing was, they didn't seem out of place. They blended in perfectly, as if they had always been there, part of my own history. I couldn't stop staring at them. My heart began to race as I flipped through the pictures, each one showing a scene more familiar, yet more unsettling than the last. In one, my grandparents were seated on a porch with a group of people, all laughing. But one of the people standing behind them, tall, with dark hair, looked exactly like my father. But he was much younger than I had ever seen him. My father had never been part of any photo like this. How could I have missed something like this all these years? I felt a sudden wave of nausea rise in my chest. The pictures felt wrong. They were mine, yet not mine. I had never seen these faces before, but they felt so familiar, as if they had always been part of my family's history. I stood up, clutching the photos to my chest, trying to steady myself. The park had gotten even quieter. The sun was almost gone, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, twisting across the ground like dark fingers. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had found. Who were these people? Why had they been hidden away in this forgotten bag? I glanced around the park. The benches, the trees, the pathways, they all seemed so ordinary, yet something about this scene felt off. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something colder, something more unnatural. I felt eyes on me, though no one was around. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I needed to get out of there. With trembling hands, I shoved the photos back into the bag and zipped it shut. But as I started to stand, I heard something. A faint noise, footsteps? No, it wasn't footsteps. It was something else. A soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. I froze. The noise came again. Closer now. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was no one. Just the trees, the empty paths, the fading light. I shook my head, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. I was being irrational. It was just the wind, or maybe a stray animal in the bushes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I picked up the bag again and began to walk away, my pace quickening. But as I moved toward the park exit, I glanced back one last time. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dimming light. A person, but wrong. Their outline was blurry, as if they weren't quite there. The shadows around them seemed to ripple, bending unnaturally. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel them staring at me. I turned and ran. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I hurried to leave the park behind. The figure never moved, but I couldn't shake the sensation that it was watching me, waiting. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, the door safely locked behind me. But even now, as I sit here with the photos in front of me, the feeling of being watched hasn't gone away. It's as if whatever I discovered in that bag wasn't meant to be found. And someone is out there waiting for me to make the next move. I can't stop thinking about those people in the photos. About my father, younger, surrounded by strangers. About the strange figure in the park. The more I think about it, the more I wonder, who were they? Why did they seem so familiar? And who or what is watching me now? I don't know how long I have before whatever is waiting for me catches up. But I know one thing for sure, I can't keep ignoring the truth. I have to figure out who these people are and why they've been hidden from me all my life. But the more I dig into this mystery, the more I feel like I'm uncovering something I wasn't meant to find. Something that might change everything I know about my family. And I'm terrified to find out what it is. The following days felt different. The city seemed to press in on me, the hum of the crowd, the chatter of people on the streets, the endless clatter of car engines, all of it became a blur. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, as if expecting someone to be there, watching, following. Every passing face felt too familiar, every shadow a little too long. But it wasn't until that night, as I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the photos again, that the full weight of my discovery settled in. I opened the bag once more, my hands trembling as I unfolded the photographs. The image of my father, younger than I had ever known him, staring back at me with that unfamiliar smile, gripped me like a vice. It was as if he were there, but not there, a version of him that never existed in my memories. The other faces in the photos were just as unsettling. I'd flipped through them a dozen times, but I kept finding new details. A man in the background of one shot, standing in the corner with a cigarette in his hand, he looked like someone I had seen before. The problem was, I had never seen him before, at least not consciously. His face nagged at the edges of my mind, familiar, yet foreign. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The pictures, the figure in the park, the odd sense of being watched, it was all beginning to feel like I was trapped in some strange dream. Or maybe it was worse than that. What if this was all real? What if I had been living a life surrounded by secrets, and I was just now beginning to uncover them? I couldn't stop thinking about the park. The figure I'd seen, the way the shadows had shifted around them, it wasn't just a trick of the light. I was sure of it. It was as if they were out of place, out of time. I had to know more. I couldn't just sit here, staring at these pictures, waiting for something to happen. I grabbed my coat and headed back to the park. It was late now, the streets quiet, the air growing colder. The park, which had seemed so familiar and safe before, now felt wrong, like the world around it had shifted, like it wasn't part of my reality anymore. My steps quickened as I approached the familiar path where I had found the bag. The shadows seemed deeper now, more menacing. The trees loomed over me, their branches swaying unnaturally in the wind. I reached the spot where I had found the backpack. It was empty now, the ground bare. No sign of anyone, no evidence of what had happened. But my heart pounded in my chest as I stepped closer. It was as if something, or someone, was waiting for me. Then, I heard it. A soft scraping noise, just like before, but this time it was closer. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. Just the wind rattling through the branches. I exhaled, forcing myself to calm down. It's just your imagination, I told myself. You're letting this get to you. But then I saw something. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. I was starting to lose my sense of time. The shadows stretched and twisted around me, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just a sensation anymore, it was real. Someone, or something, was here with me. Focus, I told myself. Don't panic. I turned back to the bench where I had sat before. It was the last place I had seen the figure, and maybe, just maybe, I could find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. As I walked toward it, the sound of footsteps followed me, soft, steady, almost in sync with my own. I stopped, then started again, deliberately, trying to gauge the distance. The steps were still there, shadowing mine. It's him, I thought. The man from the photo. I turned again, more quickly this time, but there was still no one. The path was empty. Only the cold, the dark, and the oppressive silence surrounded me. I stood frozen for a moment, struggling to make sense of it all. I had to find out who that person was. The man from the photograph. The one who had appeared in the same place, the same time as my family, yet never been part of any of my memories. And then, as I stood there, trying to process the overwhelming sense of dread, I heard it, a voice. Low, almost a whisper. You shouldn't have come back. I froze. It was the last thing I had expected. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. I turned, my heart racing, but there was no one. Who's there? I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no reply, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. I turned again, my eyes scanning the dark, and that's when I saw it. A shadow in the distance, moving closer. It was human-shaped, but it didn't seem to follow the contours of the trees or the benches, as if it was its own form, bending reality around it. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and I couldn't seem to move. Then, the shadow spoke again, louder this time. It's too late. In that moment, I realized I had made a mistake. I shouldn't have come back. And it wasn't just the shadow in front of me that I had to worry about. It was the pictures. The family photos. The memories that weren't mine, the faces that didn't belong. I had been part of something I didn't understand. Something that had been buried in time, waiting for me to find it. And now, I was caught in it. Trapped in the web of whatever dark secret had been hidden from me for so long. I had to leave, but I couldn't move. The shadow was getting closer, its form becoming clearer, but I still couldn't see its face. And then, a hand, cold, clammy, touched my shoulder. It's time to go, the voice whispered. And the darkness closed in around me. The hand on my shoulder felt like ice, its fingers pressing into my skin with an unnatural weight. Panic surged through me, but my body refused to obey. My mind screamed for movement, to run, to fight, but my feet remained frozen to the earth. The shadow's presence was suffocating, its dark form pressing in from all sides, like it was consuming the very air around me. Then the voice, that cold whisper, echoed again, closer now, almost in my ear. You don't belong here. I tried to turn, to look behind me, but I couldn't move. My heart pounded against my ribs, a deafening drum in my ears. The shadow's figure loomed larger in my peripheral vision, and I could feel its eyes, if it even had eyes, locked onto me. Suddenly, the grip on my shoulder loosened, and I stumbled forward, almost falling onto the ground. I gasped for air, as if I had been underwater, and instinctively turned to look behind me. But the shadow was gone. I blinked. I looked around again. The park was empty. The streetlights flickered, casting long, trembling shadows on the pavement. The sound of the wind through the trees was the only thing that filled the silence now, but it felt wrong, like the very atmosphere had shifted. The world around me felt off-kilter, as if I had stepped into a different version of reality, a place where the rules didn't apply. I forced myself to move, stumbling back toward the exit of the park, my breath ragged and shallow. Every step felt like a fight against an invisible force pulling me backward, but I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. I reached the park's exit and stepped onto the sidewalk, gasping for relief. The street was busy with people, cars speeding by, lights flashing in every direction. For a moment, I thought I was safe, back in the real world, where things made sense. But then, as I walked past a row of shops, something caught my eye. A reflection in a window. A face. I froze. The face was familiar, too familiar. It was my own face, but the expression was wrong. It was like I was looking at a version of myself that wasn't me. There was something empty in the eyes, something missing. The reflection seemed to move with me, as if it was following my every step, but when I stopped, it stayed frozen, staring back at me with that hollow look. My stomach churned. I looked away, but then I did it again. I glanced at the reflection in another window. This time, there were other people in the background. People I didn't recognize. They were standing in a group, smiling, laughing, but something was off about them too. They were part of any memory I had. I had never seen them before in my life. And then it hit me, those were the people from the photos. The same faces I had seen, the same strangers who had never belonged in my family's pictures. They were standing there, clear as day, in a reflection of my world. They were all around me, watching. I jerked my gaze away, my heart racing, and in that moment, I could feel the shift again, the coldness creeping back into the air, the oppressive feeling of being watched. I wasn't alone. They were here. I started walking faster, trying to shake the panic, but the faces kept following me, reflected in every surface I passed. In the glass of the shops, in puddles on the street, in the windows of passing cars. They were everywhere. I needed to get home. I needed to get somewhere, anywhere, that felt safe. But the city, once a place of comfort, now felt like a labyrinth of mirrors, trapping me in a web of unexplainable fear. I reached my apartment building and hurried inside, feeling the weight of the world press down on me. The door slammed shut behind me, and for a moment, I thought I was free. But as I made my way up the stairs to my floor, the elevator doors opened without warning. There was no one inside. I stood frozen for a second, staring at the empty space. I had never heard the elevator doors open. They had always been silent. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for my floor. As the doors closed, the small metallic box felt suddenly too tight. The air inside seemed thicker, as if it were being squeezed out of the room. My reflection in the polished elevator walls seemed too bright, too sharp, like it wasn't my own. The features were the same, but there was something wrong with it, something off. I looked away, but the reflection still lingered in the corner of my eye. It was moving, shifting, mimicking my every action, but with a slight delay. A fraction of a second. The elevator reached my floor with a sudden jolt. I stepped out, trying to ignore the sick feeling creeping up my spine. As I walked down the hallway toward my apartment, the lights flickered just once before going out completely. The darkness was absolute. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. Then came the footsteps. Soft, deliberate, just behind me. The sound of someone walking in the dark, the rhythm matching my own. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped. I turned around quickly, but there was no one. Just the empty hallway stretching out into the shadows. Focus, I told myself. You're just imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something where someone was waiting for me. I turned back toward my apartment door and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently I could hardly hold onto them. Finally, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breath. But when I looked up, I saw them. The faces. They were in the room with me. Just like in the reflections. They stood against the walls, their eyes fixed on me, expressionless, like they had been there the whole time. Watching. Waiting. And now was when I knew. I wasn't alone anymore. And the truth, whatever it was, had finally found me. The faces didn't move, didn't blink. They just stood there, perfectly still, as if they had always been in the room. My mind screamed in denial, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I spun around, looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on me. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and my feet hit the cold tile of the floor. The faces, they weren't just in the corners of the room. They were reflected in the glass of my windows, in the mirror by the hallway, in the polished surface of my coffee table. They were everywhere, staring at me, watching me with that same unnerving emptiness. I stumbled toward the kitchen, desperate to get away from their unblinking gazes. But the moment I turned my back, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible, but growing closer. A soft shuffle on the hardwood floor behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the room was as empty as it had been seconds before. I was alone. I had to be. But the silence was worse than the footsteps. It was too thick, too heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then, a voice that wasn't mine, whispered through the air. "You've seen too much." The voice was low, distant, but I knew it wasn't just in my head. It came from somewhere deep in the shadows, from beyond the walls, from the very space around me. The tone was cold, flat, no warmth, no emotion. It was just there. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened as if something were choking me. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out, now. I bolted for the door, my legs carrying me faster than I had ever moved. I had no idea where I was going, no idea what was waiting for me outside, but I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this place, where the walls felt alive, where the faces, those people, were still watching. The apartment hallway was eerily quiet as I ran down the corridor. The elevator doors were closed, but I didn't care. I ran for the stairs, stumbling down the steps in my haste. My breath was ragged, and my heart raced so violently I thought it might burst out of my chest. When I reached the street, the cool night air hit my skin like a slap, and I gasped, taking in the fresh air. The city around me was still alive, cars honking in the distance, people chatting on their phones, the hum of neon lights. Everything was normal, but everything felt wrong. I turned and looked up at my building, its silhouette rising against the dark sky. The windows in my apartment that I thought was safe, had darkened, but I could have sworn I saw something move behind the curtains. A figure. Watching. A flicker of movement from the corner of my eye caught my attention, and I turned my head quickly. The faces were there again, reflected in the windows of the nearby shops, in the glass of the streetlights. They followed me wherever I went. They weren't just in my apartment. They were out there, in the world, in the streets, in the very air around me. I couldn't escape them. I walked faster, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me again, soft and faint, but always there. Closer now, closer than before. I dared not look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing those faces behind me was too much to bear. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I hesitated, my feet grinding to a halt. The silence around me was deafening. I looked around frantically, scanning the street for any sign of movement, but it was still. Too still. Then, I heard it. A soft click. A familiar sound. The sound of a camera shutter. I whipped around, my heart thudding in my chest. The man stood there. Tall, thin, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were unmistakable. The eyes from the photographs. His figure was just an outline in the dim light, but the feeling of recognition was undeniable. This was him. The person who had been in my family's photos, the person who had never belonged. He was here, standing in front of me. He raised his hand slowly, holding something in it. A camera. And he took another photo. Click. The air around me seemed to freeze. The sound of the shutter echoed in the silence, amplifying the dread that crept up my spine. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body didn't move. I was paralyzed, locked in place by some invisible force. You shouldn't have looked, he said, his voice deep and cold. You shouldn't have found them. With those words, the world around me seemed to shift, the light flickering in strange patterns, and everything felt wrong. My eyes went blurry, and before I could react, I felt the ground beneath me tilt, as though I were sinking. The world twisted again. The faces. They were all around me. Not just in reflections, not just in the photographs, they were real, standing there, smiling at me with those empty eyes. And as everything around me turned to darkness, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just my reality. It was theirs. And I had become a part of it. The darkness consumed everything. There were no streetlights, no sounds of the city, no air. It was just cold, suffocating darkness pressing in from all sides. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart racing wildly in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't see, couldn't think. All I could do was feel the weight of those eyes, the eyes of the faces, from every direction. They were inside my mind now, and I couldn't escape them. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. I reached out, my fingers brushing against something soft, then hard, then cold again, as if the world around me was changing, shifting with each breath. I tried to run, but every step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground beneath me was pulling me down. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had descended, there was light. Blinding, white light that pierced through the void like 1,000 needles. I squinted, trying to adjust, trying to make sense of the sudden change. But all I saw was a face. Not one of the faces from the photographs. A new face. Familiar, yet alien, as if I should know it but couldn't quite place it. The eyes were hollow, unblinking, and they stared directly into mine. "Welcome," the voice was low, almost soothing. "You've finally come home." Home. The word echoed in my mind, twisting and turning like a knife. This was not home. My real home was a place of light, of life, of memories. But this was a nightmare. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, studying me. "What we want is what you've always had. A place to belong. A family. A history." I backed away, my legs weak beneath me. "No. I don't belong here. This isn't my place." The figure smiled. It was a cold, twisted smile, as if it had heard the words before and found them amusing. "No, not your place. But it is now." And before I could react, the world around me shifted again. The light faded, leaving only darkness, and I felt myself falling, plunging into an endless void. I woke with a start, gasping for air, my hands gripping the sheets beneath me. I was back in my apartment. The familiar hum of the city outside my window, the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I was awake. It had been a dream. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart. But as I reached for the glass of water on my nightstand, I froze. There, on the floor beside the bed, was the backpack. I didn't remember bringing it inside, didn't remember placing it there. My pulse quickened again, and I slowly reached for the zipper. The moment I touched it, the air in the room seemed to shift. The weight of something heavy pressed down on me, suffocating me with the silence. I opened the backpack. Inside, there were the photographs again, those strange, eerie images of my family, but with unfamiliar faces standing behind us, faces that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. The people in the background were no longer static. They moved, their eyes following me, their lips curling into unsettling smiles. I slammed the zipper shut, my hands trembling. The room seemed to spin around me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to run. The faces, they were everywhere. They had followed me from the photographs, from the darkness, from the moment I had first picked up that cursed backpack. And now, they were in my apartment, in my world. They weren't just figments of my imagination anymore. They were real. They had come for me. With a final, desperate cry, I backed away from the backpack, eyes scanning the room for any sign of escape. But I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Not anymore. They had already found me. The walls of my apartment closed in. The faces filled every corner, every shadow, every reflection. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape this reality. And as the last shred of light flickered out, I realized the truth. I had never left. I had always been a part of their world. And now, I was lost in it forever. Have you ever played a game that felt too real? The kind where you can't tell if you're still in the game or if the game has somehow crossed into your life? It happened to me, and I'll never forget it. It started like any other night. A group of friends gathered in my apartment, laughing and talking as we prepared for a casual evening. We were all close, childhood friends, really, and we had spent countless nights playing board games, watching movies, and sharing stories. But tonight felt different. The air had a slight chill to it, and the flickering of the overhead light added a strange tension that none of us could quite place. We just finished dinner when Alex pulled out an old board game from a dusty shelf. It was called Life's Play, a game none of us had ever heard of before. The box was worn and faded, the edges torn from age. It looked like something out of a forgotten time, a relic from the past. "You guys ready for something new?" Alex said, grinning as he set the box on the table. His excitement was contagious, but there was something about the game that sent a shiver down my spine. We all sat around the table, the board between us. The pieces were oddly shaped, resembling little figurines that looked too lifelike. The cards, worn and yellowed, seemed to whisper as they shuffled through our fingers. "So, the rules are simple," Alex said as he flipped through the instructions. "We take turns drawing cards, moving our pieces, and following the instructions. If you make it to the end, you win. But be careful, the game might change on you." "Change? What do you mean?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Alex just smiled cryptically. "You'll see." And so, we began. The game started off innocently enough. We rolled the dice, moved our pieces, and drew cards. The instructions on the cards were simple: move forward 3 spaces, skip a turn, take a step back. It was a typical game, the kind you forget about after a few hours of play. But then, things started to change. It was Jamie's turn. She rolled the dice, and as her piece moved, she drew a card that made her frown. The card read, "Go to the dark room. Stay there until you hear a sound." "What does that even mean?" she asked, looking at the rest of us. We all shrugged, confused but intrigued. "Just do it," Alex urged, his voice a little too eager. Jamie stood up reluctantly and walked toward the hallway, the light from the kitchen casting long shadows on the walls. We all watched her, waiting. But nothing happened. No sound, no movement. Just the stillness of the apartment. Minutes passed. Maybe the card was a joke? I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. But as I spoke, I felt an odd sensation, like the air had thickened, the temperature had dropped slightly. The silence in the room felt oppressive, heavy. And then, we heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A soft tapping, like footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was moving toward us. We all froze. No one moved. The tapping grew louder, closer. It wasn't Jamie. She was still in the dark room, her figure barely visible in the shadows. But the sound was unmistakable. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know what to say. The game had already taken a strange turn. But the tapping continued. Closer. Closer. And then, without warning, the lights flickered. Once, twice, before going completely dark. We were plunged into pitch blackness. Panic set in. "Jamie?" I called, my voice trembling. Nothing. No answer. "Jamie!" I shouted louder, but still nothing. Only the sound of our own breathing in the dark. I could feel the tension in the air, the suffocating silence. I reached out in the darkness, my hand brushing against something cold, smooth and lifeless. It was the game board. but it wasn't where it had been just moments ago. "Where's the board?" Alex whispered. I could hear the panic in his voice now. We were all terrified, but no one dared to move. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had consumed us, a single light flickered back on, the light over the table. But something was different. The board had changed. The pieces had moved. The cards had reshuffled. And the instructions, they were different now. "Draw a card," Alex said, his voice cracking. "It's my turn." I looked at him, confused. "What?" "No. We need to. Draw a card, or you lose," he said, his eyes wide, wild with fear. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I grabbed the top card. The text was different this time. It read, "Do not speak until your turn is over." I wanted to argue, to yell, but my mouth was sealed shut, as if some invisible force had locked my lips together. That was when I realized the game wasn't just describing us. It was controlling us. It was playing us. And it was far from over. The tapping started again. Louder this time. Closer. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like lead. Something was wrong. The walls around me seemed to close in, the apartment no longer feeling like a safe place. We were trapped. And the game had just begun. The silence felt like it stretched forever. The air around us was heavy, pressing down on my chest. My eyes darted around the room, but the shadows seemed to distort the familiar space, turning it into something foreign. I could still hear the tapping, the slow, deliberate footsteps. But where were they coming from? I wanted to scream, to move, to break free from the game's grip, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the darkness had taken hold of me, wrapped around my limbs, freezing me in place. My mouth, sealed shut by the unseen force, refused to obey. I could only hear the frantic breathing of my friends, their shallow, panicked gasps filling the air. The light above the table flickered again, casting shadows that danced unnaturally on the walls. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in, squeezing the air out of my lungs. It was suffocating. The game board in front of me seemed to grow larger, the pieces shifting on their own as though some invisible hand was controlling them. I looked at Alex, his eyes wide with fear. His hand shook as he reached for a card, his fingers trembling. "I have to draw," he whispered, as though reassuring himself more than anyone else. He pulled the top card from the pile. His face drained of color as he read it aloud, moved to the center of the room. "Do not look back." "What the hell is going on?" Mark muttered, his voice cracking. His eyes darted nervously from one corner of the room to the next. "This isn't normal." But Alex, his face contorted in something between terror and disbelief, didn't hesitate. He stood up and, without a word, walked to the center of the room. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he moved, the sound echoing through the apartment. The moment he stepped into the center, the room seemed to grow colder. The air thickened again, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. My breath came out in invisible puffs, clotting in front of my face. The tapping, that unnerving sound of footsteps, continued, louder now, more urgent. I strained my ears, but there was no sound of Alex's footsteps. He had stopped moving. "Alex?" I called out in a whisper, terrified of what might happen if I spoke too loudly. My voice felt unnatural, too loud in the oppressive silence of the room. Still, no response. I wanted to move, to help him, but I was rooted to the spot. I could only watch as Alex stood motionless in the center, his body rigid and unblinking. His eyes were wide, unseeing, like he was staring at something beyond the walls of the apartment, lost in a place I couldn't follow. I felt the cold touch of fear settle deeper into my bones. It wasn't just a game anymore, it was taking over. The boundaries between it and the real world were blurring, fading away until there was nothing but the rules of this twisted game. Suddenly, a sharp, eerie sound shattered the silence. A screeching, grinding noise, like metal scraping against metal. It came from behind me, from the hallway that led to the dark room. "Jamie," I gasped, my heart racing. Without thinking, I turned toward the hallway, but before I could take a step, a flash of light flickered in front of me, momentarily blinding me. The light flickered again, this time accompanied by the sound of shuffling footsteps. They were getting closer. The sound of breathing, shallow and ragged, filled the space. It wasn't just Alex. It wasn't just the game anymore. Something else was here. I tried to scream, but the force that had sealed my mouth shut clamped down even harder. My breath quickened, my heart pounding in my chest. Something, or someone, was moving in the darkness, getting closer and closer. And then, I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the low light, but its outline was unmistakable. Tall, thin, with long arms that reached unnaturally toward the ground. Its face was a blur, as if I couldn't focus on it, just shadows where eyes should be. The figure moved toward me, its footsteps silent, but its presence suffocating. The game, whatever it was, had summoned this thing. This creature. This thing wasn't part of our world. But it was here, and it was coming closer. "Alex." I cried again, but the sound didn't come out. Instead, it was swallowed by the growing darkness, drowned out by the low hum that filled the room. The creature moved past Alex, who remained still, unblinking. He hadn't even noticed it. Or had he? Was he part of it now? In that moment, I realized what was happening. The game wasn't just controlling the board. It was controlling us. Our bodies, our minds, everything was part of the game. And once you started playing, you couldn't escape. The figure was now close enough that I could feel the cold emanating from it. A cold that felt like death itself. It was within arm's reach. Without warning, the figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against my face. A jolt of ice cold terror shot through me, and I felt something snap. The air around me seemed to crack, and a voice, low, guttural, whispered in my ear, "You're next." I wanted to fight back, to scream, but the game's grip on me was too strong. I was trapped, no longer just a player, but a pawn in a game where the rules were changing before my eyes. The game had become real, and we were all going to lose. The darkness around me deepened as the figure's fingers grazed my cheek, sending chills down my spine. I tried to pull away, but my body felt frozen, as though the game had stitched me into place. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything except the presence that hovered close to me. I glanced toward Alex. He was still standing motionless in the center of the room, his eyes wide, staring at nothing, no recognition, no fear, nothing but a vacant emptiness. The thing that stood behind him was the one controlling him. I knew that now. It wasn't just a game. It was a force that manipulated everything around us, pulling strings in the shadows, bending our will to its desires. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was unbearable. I couldn't even hear my own breathing, the air too thick, like it had been drained of all oxygen. The figure, if you could even call it that, seemed to melt further into the dark, its outline barely discernible now, like a shadow in the corner of my vision. But I could still feel it. It was watching me, waiting. I had to do something. But what? My eyes flicked back to the game board. The pieces had moved. All of them. They shifted as if they were alive, rearranging themselves into an unfamiliar formation. The card I had drawn earlier, the one with the twisted instruction, was now glowing faintly, casting an eerie light over the room. I swallowed hard. The glow from the card seemed to pulse with a life of its own, beckoning me, urging me to play along. I could feel the pressure to keep going, to follow the rules. But what if the rules were the trap? "Mark," I whispered, though I could barely hear my own voice. "We need to stop this." Mark, who had been crouched in a corner, his hand clutching his head as though he were trying to block out the terror, looked up. His eyes were wild. "Stop? You think we can stop this?" His voice cracked with hysteria. "It's too late for that. This thing, it's real. It's taking us one by one." I felt a wave of panic threaten to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to breathe, steadying my thoughts. I had to think. I had to get us out of here. "Think, Jamie," I muttered under my breath. "Think. The game." That's what it kept coming back to. The game controlled everything, our actions, our thoughts, our fear. But there had to be a way to break its hold. I remembered the first rule of the game. Always follow the moves, never question the instructions. But what if questioning was the key? What if the moment I stopped following its rules, it would lose its power? I looked down at the game board, my heart pounding as I reached out a trembling hand. The pieces seemed to mock me, their shifting forms catching the dim light. I touched one, just one, and immediately I felt something snap in the air. A loud crack, like the breaking of glass, echoed through the room. The figure in the dark flinched, its form wavering for a brief moment. Mark gasped. "What did you do?" "I don't know," I whispered, eyes wide. But it felt like I broke something. The game board began to tremble, the pieces rattling as if they had a life of their own. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The shadow in the corner of my vision lurched forward. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The thing, that horrifying creature, was moving toward me now, its long, spindly limbs stretching unnaturally, its face, if you could call it a face, contorted into something grotesque. I jumped back, but my body moved against my will. The game had me again. I was no longer in control. The creature reached out for me, its cold fingers grazing my arm. The touch was like ice, but there was something more, something worse, beneath it. I felt the darkness seep into my skin, a chill that wasn't just physical but something deeper, something that was eroding my very soul. "Jamie!" Mark cried, his voice breaking. But I couldn't hear him anymore. My ears were filled with the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my chest as if it were trying to escape. And then I understood. The game wasn't just manipulating our actions. It was feeding on us. Our fear, our confusion, it was all part of the game. It thrived on it. I had to end this. I turned toward the game board, my hands shaking as I forced myself to pick up the glowing card again. It pulsed with a sickly light, the rules written on it in a language I could barely comprehend. But there was one word that stood out, clear and undeniable. Escape. I had to escape. There had to be a way out, a way to break the game's hold. I glanced back at the figure, whose form was now so close, I could feel its presence suffocating me. Escape, I whispered again, the word tasting like acid in my mouth. And then, as though the game heard me, the lights flickered once more. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, just slightly. I could breathe again, but my lungs still ached with fear. But the game was far from over. The pieces on the board continued to move. And as I looked down, I saw the instructions had changed again, the next move written clearly. One will remain. The others must choose. The words on the card glowed brighter now, their meaning settling deep within my chest, where panic had once resided. One will remain. The others must choose. I could feel it then, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was real. This wasn't a game of survival for all of us. It was a game of sacrifice. Choose? Choose what? Mark's voice trembled, his eyes darting between the board and me. What does that even mean? I didn't have an answer. But I had to make a choice, and soon. The air was thick with tension, and every second stretched longer than the last. I could hear my pulse, slow and deliberate, as if the world around me had frozen in time. The figure, the thing that had haunted us, moved again, but this time it didn't just move, it watched me. Its eyes, if it had eyes, seemed to be everywhere, filling the room, the space between my thoughts, probing my mind, looking for the weakness. I gripped the card tighter, as if it could anchor me. The rest of the room felt distant. Mark, Alex, the shadow, everything was growing hazy, out of focus, and the game board shimmered ominously. This isn't real, I told myself, my voice wavering. But the creeping doubt in my gut told me otherwise. It was real. It was becoming realer with every passing moment. Jamie? Mark's voice again. This time, it was frantic. What's happening? You have to tell me. What's going on? The decision was mine. The choice was mine to make. And as much as I wanted to say it wasn't, I knew deep down that it was. This game was testing us, twisting us into its image, one by one. Mark was no longer just my friend. He wasn't the person I could rely on for safety anymore. I had to choose. But who? Alex hadn't spoken since the game began pulling us into its depths. His face, once full of the easy laughter we'd shared, was now blank, empty. Was he even really here anymore? Was he still himself, or had the game already taken him? And Mark, he was desperate, his fear like a beacon. Could I trust him? Could I trust myself? I stared at the glowing words again, the rules that were becoming our fate. The board trembled, as if it could sense my indecision. The dark corners of the room seemed to pulse with a silent, malevolent energy, urging me to hurry. I didn't have time. I had to act. Mark, I whispered, my throat dry, I'm sorry. His face twisted in confusion. What? What are you talking about? Don't. Before he could finish, I grabbed his arm, my hand shaking as I pulled him towards the center of the room. He struggled, but I was stronger now, driven by something deeper, something the game had awakened inside me. The shadow moved again. This time, it wasn't creeping toward me. It was coming for Mark. No! No! Mark cried, trying to break free. Jamie, you don't understand. You can't. But I did understand. The moment we were all caught in the game, it was already too late. There was no winning this, there was only surviving. Only one of us could remain. And it wasn't going to be him. The figure closed the distance between us, its elongated fingers reaching for Mark's throat. Mark let out a strangled scream, his body jerking as though it were no longer in his control. I backed away, the decision final, the air now thick with dread. A sound broke the silence. It was a soft thud, followed by another. Mark's body went limp. The thing, the game, had claimed its prize. I couldn't breathe. I felt sick, my stomach churning as I stared at the lifeless body before me. Mark's eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of terror. But it wasn't his body that mattered now. It wasn't his life. It was the game. The board was still glowing. I couldn't look away. The pieces continued to move. The next card slid out, silent, uninviting. One will remain. The others must choose. Alex? I whispered hoarsely, my voice barely rising above the weight of the moment. But when I turned to him, he wasn't there. The air had shifted. He was gone, vanished into the same darkness that had swallowed Mark whole. The figure, the game, turned to me now, its form flickering in and out like a distorted reflection. You were always the one, it whispered, its voice a mockery of my own. I stumbled back, horrified. No, I don't want this. I don't want to play anymore. The figure grinned, or at least, I thought it grinned. Its form was becoming more human, more familiar. I could feel my mind reeling as it shaped itself into something I recognized. It was me. The game had already won. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, as the figure, me, loomed in front of me. Its face was an exact replica of mine, but twisted, distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. The eyes weren't my eyes. They were hollow, empty voids that seemed to pierce right through me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The weight of the situation settled around me like a heavy fog, suffocating my thoughts. You're not real, I stammered, shaking my head. You're just part of the game. You can't be real. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a smile that brought comfort. It was cruel, mocking, like it was enjoying my fear. I'm real, Jamie, it said in my voice, but it wasn't my voice. It was deeper, darker, warped with something that shouldn't have been there. I've always been here. Inside you. In every choice, every fear, every secret you've buried. I stumbled backward, tripping over the remnants of the game board. The pieces scattered across the floor like broken dreams. The room felt smaller, closing on me with every passing second. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. No, this isn't happening, I whispered to myself, barely able to hold on to any shred of sanity. The figure took a step forward, its presence growing more imposing. You think you can escape? You think you can get out of this game? It reached out, and for a moment, I thought it would touch me, pull me in. But instead, it merely extended a hand, as if offering me a choice. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't move. My mind was spiraling, torn between the horror of what I was seeing and the realization that this was my fault. I had brought us here. I had made the choice to play. The game isn't over, the figure murmured, almost sympathetically. Not until it has what it wants. Not until it takes you. I finally found my voice. No, you're just part of it. You're not real. You're a lie. The figure's smile widened. Am I? Or are you the lie, Jamie? Who are you really? The player or the pawn? A sickening realization hit me like a tidal wave. I had thought the game was a simple distraction, something we could control. But now, I understood. It wasn't just a game. It was feeding on us. It was taking pieces of us, our memories, our fears, our very identities, and turning them into something else. Something dark. And it was asking me to make the final choice. I can't, I choked on the words, fighting back the panic rising in my throat. The figure cocked its head, as if studying me. You can. You've already chosen. The game has always been about who survives. Who gets to leave. Who gets to win. I don't want to win, I spat, tears welling in my eyes. I want out. I want it to stop. The figure's form flickered again, the edges of its body distorting like it was being erased from existence. And then, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it whispered, "Then you should have never played." Suddenly, everything shifted. The room, the shadows, the sounds, all of it warped. I could feel myself being pulled, dragged toward the center of the game board. The pieces began to spin around me, the glowing cards swirling like a vortex. I reached out, grabbing at the table, but there was nothing solid to hold on to. I was being sucked into the void. I screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness around me thickened until I couldn't see or hear anything except my own rapid breathing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. I was back in my apartment. The game board lay on the table in front of me, undisturbed. The room was quiet. Too quiet. I blinked, unsure of what had just happened. My heart was still racing, but everything felt normal. Real. No shadows. No figures. No distorted version of myself. I looked around, searching for any sign of what had occurred. But there was nothing. The apartment felt empty, still. Too still. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling. Had it all been a nightmare? Had I imagined it? But then, I noticed something. The card was still there, lying face up on the table. One will remain. The others must choose. And beside it, written in the same cold, glowing script, only one can survive. You all play the game. I froze. The game wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.